The Origins of Nazi Violence. Enzo Traveso. Foreword. Introduction. 1/Discipline, punishing, killing. 2a. The guillotine and serialized death. Prison and the disciplining of bodies. Excursus on the Nazi concentration camp system, factories and the division of labor, bureaucratic administration. Conquest. Imperialism. The extinction of races. Colonial wars and crimes. Nazism and Lebensraum. 3/Destruction, total war, the Fordist army, mass anonymous death, soldiers, civilians, and concentration camps, war memory, lives unworthy of life, a laboratory of fascism. LV. 4/Classification and repression, Jewish Bolshevism, class racism, the Nazi synthesis, excursus on racial hygiene. 5/Extermination, Nazi antisemitism, the Jew as an abstraction, regenerative violence. Conclusion. As is often the case, this book began as a short essay that grew as the months passed. It is a summary of research that I had the opportunity to discuss within the framework of a number of seminars, conferences, and colloquia in a variety of countries. I should like to thank all the friends and colleagues who were patient enough to read the text in its successive versions, and then to comment upon it: Miguel Abensauer, Alain Brosset, Federico Finkelstein, Eric Hazen, Roland Liu, Michael Lowy, Arnaud J. Meyer, Magali Molini, Elfie Miller, and Paula Traverso. Their criticisms and sometimes also their disagreements helped me to focus more clearly and to complete this work. Ultimately, however, responsibility for it is mine alone. Over the past 20 years, Nazi violence has invaded our collective memory and our representations of the 20th century. Because of the place that it occupies in our historical consciousness, Auschwitz, its emblematic topos, has acquired a prominence comparable to that of the fall of the Roman Empire, the Reformation, or the French Revolution, although from the point of view of the diachronic unfolding of the past, it is not possible to confer upon it a significance analogous to that of those temporal caesuras. The fall of the Roman Empire marked the end of antiquity. The Reformation altered the relationship between God and humans by laying the foundations for the secularization of their ways of life and their vision of the world. As for the French Revolution, it upset the relations between individuals and the authorities in power by changing the former from subjects into citizens. Those events have taken on the dimension of major historical turning points that stand out as reference marks in the development of the West. World War II constituted one of the great watersheds of the 20th century, and the genocide of the Jews took place within that context. Nevertheless, from the point of view of its consequences, that genocide cannot be compared to the turning points mentioned above. Auschwitz did not change the forms of civilization. If the gas chambers are today perceived as a break in civilization, it is precisely because they represent a moment that revealed the blind alleys into which civilization had stumbled and that break's destructive potential. Counter-Enlightenment tendencies, combined with industrial and technical progress, a state monopoly over violence, and the rationalization of methods of domination, revealed extermination to be one of the faces of civilization itself. On the other hand, from the point of view of the history of the Jews, in which, in the most tragic way, it definitely constituted the culmination of a European phase, the destruction of Europe's Jews did represent a radical historical turning point. It has taken the Western world a good 30 years to grasp the measure of that mutilation. Auschwitz, a laceration in the body of Europe that has not, however, altered the framework of its civilization, thus constitutes a trauma that is hard to apprehend, for a historical explanation of what happened does not pierce what Primo Levi has called the black hole of its understanding. A yawning gap remains in our almost obsessive recognition of the violence of the Holocaust, between the central position that it occupies in our mental picture of that turning point in the century, and the void constituted by its rational intelligibility. The problem is frequently circumvented by antinomic approaches to it. Some elevate the genocide of the Jews to the status of a metaphysical entity, a memory that stands outside history, surrounded by the dogma of its normative impenetrability. The writer Elie Wiesel, in particular, is notable for adopting this position. Others settle for a functionalist historicization, which Dan Diner has justifiably described as a methodological retreat into a description of structures. The great and unquestionable merit of this historicization, certainly the indispensable bedrock of our knowledge, is to have established the fact of the genocide of the Jews of Europe in all its multiple dimensions. But, however indispensable, that factual illumination does not in itself make any sense of it. A historically unique aspect to the Jewish genocide is that it was perpetrated for the specific purpose of a biological remodeling of the human race. It was conceived not instrumentally as a means to an end but as an end in itself. Hannah Arendt seized upon that point in her essay Eichmann in Jerusalem when she stressed that the Nazis assumed the right to decide who should and who should not inhabit the world. That was an extreme decision, and as Saul Friedlander remarks, one that was reached only once in modern history, by the Nazis. One response to the assertion of the Holocaust's historical uniqueness might be that all historical events are historically unique. But according to Georgian Habermas, the uniqueness of the show also possesses a new anthropological dimension in which he discerns the signature of the whole period. At the time of the historians' quarrel in Germany in the 1980s, he wrote, "Something happened there that until then nobody would have believed possible. A deep sphere of solidarity between all those who possessed a human face was affected. Despite all that world history has witnessed in the way of crude bestiality, up until that moment people had unquestioningly accepted that the integrity of that deep sphere had remained intact. And since that moment, a link has been broken, a link of naivete from which traditions confidently used to draw their authority and which in general fostered historical continuities. Auschwitz changed the conditions that allowed the historical tissues of life to perpetuate themselves spontaneously, and it was not only in Germany that it did so. Auschwitz introduced the word genocide into our vocabulary. The uniqueness of Auschwitz perhaps lies above all in the fact that only after what happened there did we realize that in fact genocide tears apart the historical tissue that betokens a primary solidarity underlying human relations, which allows human beings to recognize one another as fellow humans despite their hostilities, their clashes, and their wars. Recognition of this uniqueness of Auschwitz was a long time in coming, both for our historical consciousness and for the historiography of Nazism, but it eventually brought to an end a long period of indifference, concealment, and repression. Its consequences were twofold: on the one hand, the considerable progress made by historiography, on the other, a collective anamnesis recovery of memory on the part of the Western world. But those changes took place back in the 1980s, their repeated ritual reaffirmation is today in danger of turning into purely rhetorical discourse whose effect is to impoverish and limit our epistemological horizon. Unique though Nazism was, its history cannot be understood exclusively as a phenomenon occurring only within the geographical frontiers of Germany and the temporal frontiers of the 20th century. In order to study it, it is necessary to adopt a perspective both diachronic and comparative. In the past, the Jewish genocide was relegated to a brief footnote in books on World War II. Now, however, its unprecedented and absolutely unique character is emphasized, and the danger is that this may thwart attempts to apprehend the event within the framework of European history as a whole. Arno J. Meyer is right to criticize the methodology of Fernand Braudel and to stress that Treblinka and Auschwitz force historians to reconsider the importance of short-term phenomena, for in the space of 3.5 years, between I-941 and the end of 1944, Nazism wiped out a community that had been part of the history of Europe for 2,000 years. In some places, such as Poland, where the Jewish community's existence had consti. 5+ Introduction. 2. The social, economic, and cultural element of the greatest importance in the life of the country as a whole, this community was almost totally eradicated. It is quite true that this sudden and irreversible annihilation calls into question the Braudelian approach to history, which reduces events to surface agitation, merely a superficial and ephemeral froth that the tides produce on their powerful swell degree, but it also underlines the need to study the long-term historical premises that foreshadowed the show. In other words, All attempts to understand the genocide must take into account both the singularity of the event and its inscription in the long view of history. It would clearly be impossible to apply to the final solution de Tocqueville's famous remarks concerning the historical break begun in 1789, the revolution, in a feverish and convulsive effort, without transition, without precautions, without regard for anything, finished off what would have been done anyway, little by little, in the long run. This was its effect. The show reversed a tendency believed at the time to be irreversible, a tendency leading to the closure of ghettos, the emancipation of the Jews, and their integration and cultural assimilation into the social mainstream of European nations. The final solution represented a historical caesura, a break that, instead of speeding up a process that would gradually have been completed of its own accord, destroyed the apparently lasting achievements of the movement of emancipation that began during the Enlightenment and was subsequently realized in most of Europe in the course of the 19th century. But historical breaks, even the most violent and traumatic of them, always have origins. To grasp the origins of the Jewish genocide, we must overcome the limitations that often confine its interpretation and seek its material and cultural preconditions within a wider context than that of the history of anti-Semitism. It was the French Revolution that invented the Enlightenment. Roger Chartier has declared in brilliantly elliptical fashion. Similarly, you could say that it was Auschwitz that invented anti-Semitism, by conferring the appearance of a coherent, cumulative, and linear process upon a body of discourse and practices that, before Nazism, had been perceived in the various European countries as discordant, heterogeneous, and in many cases decidedly archaic. Anti-Semitism certainly did not dominate the historical scene. It undeniably had a place in the history of the 19th century, but it became increasingly eroded and forced onto the defensive. In particular among the assimilated Jews of the Western world, the tendency was to regard the hostility directed toward them as tenacious but on the whole anachronistic prejudice. Witness the reception of the Dreyfus affair outside France. The birth of modern anti-Semitism, the transformation of the age-old exclusion on religious grounds into racial hatred affirmed in the name of science, attracted minimal attention from contemporaries or indeed went completely unnoticed. The cultural origins of Nazism cannot be reduced to counter-Enlightenment feeling, to Völkisch ideology and racial anti-Semitism. They reach much further. The present study, which aims to explore the material conditions and mental frameworks that made the Jewish genocide possible, will have to go back to before RG-14 and range beyond the frontiers of Germany. Two dangers must be avoided like Scylla and Charybdis. On the one hand, a dissolution of this crime in a long historical process, which has the effect of effacing its particular features, on the other, an exclusively show-centric interpretation of history. The possible danger of a historicization of National Socialism that reduces its crimes to one particular moment in World War II, if not to a marginal aspect of it, is clearly that it may relativize the Jewish genocide, or even trivialize it. Registered in the 7 Introduction. Mid-80s, Martin Broschett pleaded for a change of optics, which would make it possible to end the insularization of the Hitlerian period and simultaneously avoid interpreting the past through the prism of Auschwitz. But this approach was likewise unable to avoid the dangers of a relativizing historicization. The tendency to interpret the final solution as a product, neither foreseen nor calculated, of a cumulative radicalization of the Hitlerian regime in the course of the war reveals the dead ends of a historicization of Nazism that reduces its principal crime to the level of an event without a subject. But to focus exclusively on the criminal, genocidal outcome of Nazism is to make the mistake of adopting an extremely restrictive, even ahistorical, approach according to which the German past is either isolated and criminalized as a whole, or else annulled by the unexpected and brutal eruption of Hitlerian violence. This would be tantamount to either reducing the German past to an anteroom of Auschwitz or else to interpreting the Jewish genocide as a cataclysm without antecedents or causes, as if the mental frameworks of the executioners, their practices, means of action, and ideology belonged neither to their age nor to their civilized context, namely that of the Europe or the Western world of the first half of the 20th century. Auschwitz would thus remain a total enigma, irreducible to all attempts at historicization, in short, a no man's land for comprehension. Degree the public use of the history that takes shape in this intellectual landscape, which oscillates uncertainly between a show that is blindingly visible and one that is beyond comprehension, cannot fail to raise questions. Paradoxically, the implantation of Auschwitz at the heart of Western memory coincides with the repression, as alarming as it is dangerous, of the European roots of National Socialism. Among many historians today there is a widespread tendency to eject the Nazi crimes from the trajectory of the Western world. I shall limit myself to an examination of the three best-known interpretations of Nazism produced during the past 2 decades. Not one of them is really new, but all have been formulated in new ways: Nazism as an anti-Bolshevist reaction, Nazism as a rejection of liberalism, symmetrical to communism, Nazism as a German pathology. Registered. In Ernst Nolte's analysis, the genocide of the Jews is presented as the extreme outcome of a European civil war whose beginning he dates not to 1914, when the old continental order established in Vienna a century earlier burst apart, but to 1917 and the Russian Revolution, which led to the founding, 2 years later, of the Comintern, a world civil war party. This is the well-known thesis that ignited the Historikerstreit debate among German historians in 1986. Auschwitz was seen as a copy, certainly a radical and outrageous, even unique, one derived from the Asiatic barbarity originally introduced into the West by Bolshevism. What can be the explanation for the Nazi crimes perpetrated by a regime produced by a modern, civilized European nation? According to Nolte, the answer is provided by the trauma provoked in Germany by the October Revolution. He claims that Bolshevism, the first example of a totalitarian regime that, right from the start of the Russian Civil War, practiced a policy of terror and class extermination, did upon the German imaginary both as a repellent and as a model. Asterisk, as he sees it, Nazi antisemitism was simply a particular kind of anti-Bolshevism, and the Jewish genocide an inverted but every bit as tendentious image of the extermination of a world class by the Bolsheviks. In support of his thesis, Nolte points to an undeniable fact: the massive presence of Jews in the Russian and international communist movement. Given that the Jews were held to be responsible for the massacres perpetrated by Bolshevism, the conclusion reached was that it was necessary, by way of reprisals and for preventative reasons, to exterminate. 2 degrees Auschwitz was thus explained by the class genocide of the Bolsheviks, the logical and factual precedent for the Nazi crimes. Asterisk. So much has already been written on Nolte's theses, both their outrageous simplifications of the historical process, which completely annul the German origins of National Socialism, and also their overtly apologetic aims, that no more now needs to be said. To be sure, Nolte does seize upon one essential aspect of National Socialism, its counter-revolutionary nature as a movement born in reaction against the Russian Revolution, against Marxism, and against militant communism. That is true of fascism, of Mussolini before Hitler, and more generally of the counter-revolution that is always inextricably, symbiotically linked with revolution. October 1917 shocked the European bourgeoisie no doubt as deeply as 1789, and its aftermath affected the aristocracy. The alarm and fear provoked among the ruling classes by the communist dictatorship, and also, in Central Europe, by the ephemeral revolutionary experiments that followed it, ranging from the Spartacist revolt in Berlin to the Soviet republics of 1G 1G9 in Bavaria and Hungary, were certainly considerable. But, contrary to what Nolte suggests, the fact that National Socialism first took off as an anti-communist movement does not mean that its anti-Semitism was born along with the counter-revolution, let alone that it was justifiable to represent it as a copy of Bolshevism. Nazism's roots were solidly embedded in the tradition of Völkisch nationalism that for decades had been permeating the various currents of conservative German culture. Hitler became anti-Semitic in Vienna at the beginning of the century, at a time when he could not yet have been influenced by anti-communism or alarmed by the presence of Jews in the Russian Revolution and the political uprisings of Central Europe. But remembering that anti-Semitism preceded anti-Bolshevism is not enough. The fascist counter-revolution did not limit itself to restoring the old order, it transcended the past, taking on a modern dimension aimed at building a new social and political order, and operated as a revolution against the revolution, hence the revolutionary rhetoric of the fascists, which was as striking in Italy as it was in Germany. But the content of the counter-revolution also mobilized more ancient elements. Although the Nazi movement took shape under the Weimar Republic, its ideology was nurtured by a complex of elements that already existed before World War I and the Russian Revolution, and that were then radicalized in the context created by the German defeat and the rise of communism. It was from the German and European culture of the 19th century that Nazism inherited its imperialism, its pan-Germanism, its nationalism, its racism, its eugenics, and its anti-Semitism. Anti-Bolshevism was a later addition to these, it exacerbated them, but it did not create them. Fauret's anti-communism conforms more closely to the dominant zeitgeist. Having used a philosophically and historically questionable identification between classical liberalism and democracy, the world of the liberal and that of democracy are philosophically identical, he tried to reduce fascism and communism to parenthetical phenomena that cropped up in the ineluctable path of liberal democracy. In The Passing of an Illusion he wrote, "The great secret behind the complicity between Bolshevism and fascism remained the existence of that common enemy which the two opposing doctrines would downplay or exorcise with the idea that it was on its last legs, quite simply democracy." In his correspondence with Nolte. Introduction. Fauret rightly criticized the vision of Nazism as a simple anti-Bolshevik reaction, and stressed the uniqueness of the Nazi crimes, and this makes his analyses more balanced and more nuanced than those of his German interlocutor. However, from a macro-historical point of view, it was, as he sees it, anti-liberalism that constituted the essential feature of both Nazism and communism, and that, despite their deadly hostility, placed them on a par in any picture of the century. Fauret claims that both are short-term episodes, framed by that which they sought to destroy. Themselves products of democracy, they were also consigned to the grave by democracy. Emphasizing that neither fascism nor communism turned out to be the ensign of a providential destiny for humanity, Fauret implies that such a providential destiny really did exist and was represented by their common enemy and conqueror, liberalism. That was the classic position of liberal anti-totalitarianism. In November 1939, a few months after the outbreak of World War II, an American political analyst, Carlton J. Hayes, commented in a similar vein, but in a more dramatic and inspired style. The dictatorial totalitarianism of today is a reaction, nay more, a revolt against the whole historic civilization of the West. It is a revolt against the moderation and proportion of classical Greece, against the order and legality of ancient Rome, against the righteousness and justice of the Jewish prophets, against the charity and mercy and peace of Christ, against the whole vast cultural heritage of the Christian Church in the Middle Ages and modern times, against the Enlightenment, the reason and the humanitarianism of the 18th century, against the liberal democracy of the 19th. It repudiates all these major constituents of our historic civilization and wars to the death on any group that retains affectionate memory of them. The Austrian ex-communist Franz Borkenau, who described the USSR as red fascism and Nazi Germany as brown Bolshevism, was at about the same time representing totalitarianism as a world revolution that threatened all the values that have been handed down from Athens and Jerusalem, through the Rome of the emperors and the Rome of the popes, to the Reformation, the Age of Enlightenment, and the present age. Although unable to allow themselves the pacific and distant tone of the French, Fauret, Hayes, and Borkenau likewise considered the totalitarian dictatorships to be a recent novelty that they hoped would be ephemeral, adding that they represented no more than an episode in the history of Western civilization, now crowned by modern liberalism. Half a century later, Fauret confirmed that diagnosis, according to which totalitarianism became a kind of anti-Western phenomenon. This view of totalitarianism as an anti-liberal parenthesis is curiously close to that already expressed, at the end of the war, by Benedetto Croce, who described it as an intellectual and moral sickness of Europe's, a deviation from the natural course of history. 8. Now let us turn to Goldhagen. His explanation of the Jewish genocide is strictly limited to a single cause. It stemmed from what, by reference to the conflicts of history, could be called a form of extensive intentionalism. In his view, the sole and sufficient key to understanding Auschwitz was antisemitism, not so much that of Hitler as, above all and essentially, that of the Germans as a whole. For Goldhagen, the roots of the show were to be found not in the historical context of modern Europe but in a structural flaw in German history. In other words, he proposed to analyze it, in vitro, as the inevitable result of a German sickness, the first symptoms of which had appeared with Luther. This is a new version, simplified and radicalized, of the classic thesis of the Deutsche Sonderweg, the German special way. Goldhagen believes that the Jewish genocide, 13 plus introduction, was conceived as a German national project of which, in the last analysis, Hitler was merely the chief executor. The Holocaust was the defining aspect of Nazism, but not only of Nazism, it was also the defining feature of German society during the Nazi period. Asterisk. The direct executors, whom he calculates to have numbered 100,000 individuals, possibly even 500,000 or more, acted with the support of the whole of German society, which for several centuries had been haunted by the belief that the Jews ought to die. In order to confer an appearance of veracity upon this picture of a modern Germany totally steeped in an eliminationist antisemitism, Goldhagen is obliged to simplify its past and, above all, not to set it within a European context. This vision of a nation of pogromists quite simply overlooks the fact that at the turn of the century the main German political party, Social Democracy, opposed antisemitism and included a very large number of Jews among its members. It also overlooks the steady growth of an extensive socio-economic and intellectual group of German-speaking Jews in the period stretching from the 1870 unification to the Weimar Republic, a growth that, despite the rise of Völkisch nationalism, was probably unmatched in the rest of Europe. There is no question of defending the myth of a Judeo-German symbiosis, but it is important to recognize that the Jews did manage to carve out for themselves a place admittedly precarious and ill-defined, but nevertheless real within German society. Simply by casting a glance over the continent as a whole, it is quite clear that at the beginning of the 20th century Germany looked like a happy once-land for European Jews when compared to the waves of antisemitism unleashed in France by the Dreyfus Affair, in Russia by the Tsarist pogroms, in the Ukraine and Bohemia by the trials for ritual murder, and even in the Austria of Karl Lueger, the Christian social populist and openly anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna. In Germany, antisemitism could not have become the ideology of the Nazi regime without the trauma of World War I and a dislocation of social relations throughout the country. In short, antisemitism would not have become the Nazi ideology had it not been for a number of factors: chaotic and divisive social modernization, chronic political instability under the Weimar Republic, a profound and prolonged economic crisis, the rise of aggressive nationalism fueled by the fear of Bolshevism, and the threat of a German revolution between 1918 and 1923, and finally the longing for a charismatic leader, who eventually materialized in a sinister figure whose popularity, without the historical context, would never have spread beyond a handful of Munich beer cellars. The brute violence of the SS special units was not a feature peculiar to National Socialism. Rather, it was an indication of how much National Socialism had in common with plenty of the other lethal ideologies of the terrible 20th century that condoned massacres, ranging from the mass executions of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire to the ethnic cleansing operations in the former Yugoslavia and the machete slaughtering in Rwanda. Unlike these, however, the Jewish genocide constituted not only an eruption of brute violence but also a killing operation perpetrated without hatred, thanks to a planned system designed for the production of death on an industrial scale, a mechanical apparatus created by a minority of architects of crime and operated by a mass of executioners, some of them zealous, the rest unthinking, amid the silent indifference of the greater majority of the German population and with the complicity of Europe and a passive world. Therein lies the singularity of the Jewish genocide, and it is an aspect upon which Goldhagen's book does not even touch. Its apology for the West, which is implicit in its thesis of a German pathology, takes on a caricatural form when the author explains, in a footnote, that the sudden disappearance of that visceral and atavistic anti-Semitism in post-war German society was the immediate and miraculous consequence of the Allied occupation. Essentially, after the war the Germans were re-educated. On the basis of sharper reasoning and with more worthy motives, a fundamentally similar thesis was defended by Jürgen Habermas. In his generous plea for a constitutional patriotism opposed to any heritage of a German nation conceived in ethnic terms Staatsbürger as opposed to Stammgenossen, he too adopted the thesis of the Deutsche Sonderweg, stressing that it was only after and through Auschwitz that Germany became integrated into the West. Degree the interpretations advanced by Nolte, Ferret, and Goldhagen rest upon and isolate undeniable factors. The Jewish genocide was the extreme outcome of an age-old anti-Semitism that had developed specific traits in Germany. National Socialism was a counter-revolutionary movement fueled by its radical opposition to Bolshevism, and the final solution was conceived and put into operation during a crusading war against the USSR, both communism and fascism, for different reasons and with different methods, opposed liberalism. All the above three readings are based on real data but projected in a unilateral fashion onto the picture of the age and, by dint of a strictly monocausal interpretation, produce a distorted image. What is more, over and above their differences, they share the same apologetic attitude vis-a-vis the Western world, which is seen either as the healer of a Germany that strayed into its special way on its path toward modernity, or as the receptacle of a nationalistic tradition that was perfectly legitimate despite its excesses, or even as the source of a historically innocent liberal order. But Nazism cannot be reduced to a rejection of political introduction plus 16. Modernity or to a counter-Enlightenment attitude. Nazism's vision of the world also integrated an idea of science and technology that was in no way archaic and that on numerous points harmonized with the culture of liberal 19th century Europe. The Western world, for its part, was not exclusively committed to the general principles of the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It had other faces, too, and it also functioned in accordance with other concepts of the relations between human beings, other concepts of space, and other ways of using rationality and applying technology. The study that follows therefore stands in opposition to the above three interpretations. It endeavors to draw attention to the deeper roots of Nazism and of its violence and genocide, roots that lie in the history of the West, in the Europe of industrial capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and the rise of modern science and technology, the Europe of eugenics and social Darwinism, in short, the Europe of the long 19th century that ended in the battlefields of World War I. The latter was undeniably a moment of rupture, a profound social and psychological upheaval that is currently regarded as the founding act of the 20th century. Without that break, in which lay the origin of the various forms of fascism as well as of communism, the industrial extermination set in operation in the Nazi camps would have been inconceivable. The eruption of the new century abruptly brought an end to the persistence of forms both political and, to a large extent, mental inherited from the Ancien regime, and this violently precipitated a whole collection of elements that had been accumulating throughout the 19th century, ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of mass society which, to be sure, experienced a considerable spurt of acceleration from 1870 onward. Many factors form the background to the Great War, advances in industrial production that, on the eve of that war, led to the Ford Motor Company assembly line, the reorganization of territory within the various states as a result of the extension of railway lines and the rationalization of public administration, the scientific innovations and developments that prompted the startling advance in communications technology, the modernization of armies and the completion of the process of colonial conquest and partition in the extra-European world, the formation of new urban bourgeois and petit bourgeois elites, which limited the still solid prerogatives of the old aristocratic strata and became the vector of nationalist ideologies, the contamination of racism, anti-Semitism, and traditional forms of exclusion by new scientific paradigms, which brought about an unprecedented synthesis of ideology and science. All these transformations underlay the qualitative leap that the Great War marked in both the development and the perception of violence. They were already established before 1914 and constituted the material and cultural basis of the upheavals that Europe was to experience in the course of the first half of the 20th century. The aim of this study is not to discover the causes of National Socialism, prompted by the haunting preoccupation with origins that, according to Mark Bloch, constituted a sickness among historians, who frequently forgot that a historical phenomenon cannot be fully explained without a study of its own time. The present genealogy seeks not causes in a determinist perspective but rather origins in the sense in which Hannah Arendt uses this word, elements that become constitutive in a historical phenomenon only after being condensed and crystallized within it. An event illuminates its own past, but cannot be deduced from it. So it is not a matter of reconstructing the process of the radicalization of the Nazi regime right up to its final collapse, that is to say the accumulation of factors and the constellation of circumstances that made its crimes possible. Rather, the aim is to seize upon the elements of the civilizational context in which that regime existed, elements that throw light upon it and, retrospectively, can be seen to constitute its origins. The present study owes a great deal to the intuitions of Hannah Arendt that are set out in the Origins of Totalitarianism, intuitions relating to the link between Nazism and the racism and imperialism of the 19th century. Despite the differences in their analyses of fascism concerning the impact of its symbolic and aesthetic dimension and the role that World War I played in its genesis, Sternhell and Moss are in agreement in attributing virtually no importance to the heritage of European imperialism and colonialism in the formation of the ideology, culture, mental world, and practices of fascism. Sternhell quite rightly underlines the cleavage that biological racism opened up between Italian fascism and German National Socialism, but at the same time reduces the latter to two distinct variants of the same cultural and ideological wave of reaction against the Enlightenment that developed during the last quarter of the 19th century. Moss seizes upon the premonitory signs of modern racism detectable in the rationalism and early scientific ideas of the 18th century and then goes on to study the rise of Völkisch ideology and anti-Semitism within German culture, producing a superb analysis of its literary, iconographical, and popular manifestations. Remarkably, however, both Sternhell and Moss ignore the role played by imperialism and colonialism in the nationalization of the masses and in the formation of a belligerent, aggressive, inegalitarian, and anti-democratic nationalism. Neither noted the connection between the emergence of this new nationalism and the imperial practices of liberal Europe, let alone interpreted the instances of colonial violence as the first implementation of the exterminatory potentialities of modern racist discourse. There is no attempt here to blank out the uniqueness of Nazi violence by simply assimilating it to the massacres of colonialism. But we do need to recognize that it was perpetrated in the middle of a war of conquest and extermination waged between 1941 and 1945, which was conceived as a colonial war within Europe, a colonial war whose ideology and principles were borrowed largely from those of classic 19th century imperialism, albeit in conjunction with much more modern, powerful, and murderous means and methods. Although the victims of the final solution may have embodied the image of otherness in the Western world, otherness that had been the object of religious persecution and racial discrimination ever since the Middle Ages, the historical circumstances of their destruction indicate that that ancient and particular kind of stigmatization had been rethought in the light of the colonial wars and genocides. Nazism brought together and fused two paradigmatic figures, the Jew, the other of the Western world, and the subhuman, the other of the colonized world. My argument will proceed on two levels. On the one hand, I have tried to reconstruct the material premises for the Nazi extermination, the modernization and serialization of the technical means of slaughter during the period between the Industrial Revolution and World War I. The gas chambers and cremation furnaces were the outcome of a long process of dehumanization and of the industrialization of death, one that integrated the instrumental rationality, both productive and administrative, of the modern Western world. On the other hand, I have endeavored to study the fabrication of racist and anti-Semitic stereotypes that drew heavily on the glorification of science in the late 19th century. First, the rise of a class racism that reinterpreted the social conflicts of the industrial world in terms of race and conflated the working classes with the savages of the colonial world, then the diffusion of a new interpretation of civilization that was based on eugenicist models, and finally, the emergence of a new image of the Jew, based on the figure of the intellectual, as a metaphor for a sickness in the social body. These two levels, the one material and the other ideological, began to converge during World War I, truly the laboratory of the 20th century, and were finally synthesized in National Socialism. Discipline. Punishing, killing. The guillotine and serialized death. The French Revolution marked a turning point in the metamorphoses of violence in the Western world. I do not intend to put the Enlightenment once more on trial in order in the wake of Jacob L. Tallman to locate the roots of totalitarian terror, nor to show that the Revolutionary Tribunal and the war in the Vendée produced the forerunners of modern practices of political extermination. Instead, I shall concentrate on the guillotine, perfected from the early 18th century Italian mania, as the representative of an essential stage in the process of serializing methods of execution. If the execution of Louis XVI symbolized the end of the Ancien Regime, the instrument used, the guillotine, was the harbinger of modernity in the culture and practices of death. A few decades after its introduction, the poet Lamartine accurately grasped the anthropological mutation that it implied. This machine, invented in Italy and brought to France through the humanity of a famous doctor by the name of Guillotine, who was a member of the Constituent Assembly, replaced the atrocious and degrading torments that the Revolution wished to abolish. As the constituent legislators saw it, it possessed the added advantage of not shedding one man's blood with the hand and the frequently inaccurate blow of another, but of carrying out the murder with an instrument as soulless and unfeeling as wood and as infallible as iron. At the signal of the executioner, the axe fell automatically. That axe, the weight of which was increased 100-fold by two weights attached beneath the scaffold, slipped down between two grooves in a movement at once horizontal and perpendicular, like that of a saw, and detached the head from the trunk through the weight of its fall and with lightning speed. In the sensation of death, pain and time were suppressed. To understand the novelty of the guillotine, we need to remember what capital punishment under the Ancien Regime was like. Joseph de Maistre described this public ritual in an unforgettable page of his Césaires de St. Petersburg. The picture that the Savoyard aristocrat painted of the executioner reflects both horror and admiration, for he set the latter up as a pillar of the traditional order. He described his arrival at the scaffold, the silent, palpitating crowd, the terrorized countenance of the victim, his mouth gaping like a furnace, his shrieks, his bones snapping under the crusher, the spurting blood that bespattered the pitiless executioner as the horrified spectators looked on. De Maistre expressed a kind of respect for this abject-seeming figure who, however, seemed to him indispensable to society, shunned in horror by his fellows but feared and accepted as the secular arm of authority, of a divine, transcendent order that insisted upon submission and obedience. God, who is the author of sovereignty, is therefore also the God of punishment. For de Maistre, the executioner took on the features of an extraordinary creature who embodied at once the horror and the bond of human association. In a remarkable essay devoted to de Maistre, Isaiah Berlin stressed the modernity of his vision of the executioner. It was a far cry from the optimism of the Enlightenment, which postulated a perfectible human race, ready to be shaped by reason and teleologically oriented toward progress. To de Maistre, humanity seemed a despicable and sordid species, always ready to kill, the subject of a history that he preferred to represent as a ceaseless carnage. Berlin comments that although the facade of de Maistre's writings is certainly classical, the kernel within it is terribly modern. It is quite simply a vision of a political order founded on terror. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th century were to set about realizing this vision. The power of de Maistre's oeuvre stems precisely from its mixture of modernity and obscurantism, Its visionary premonition of a universe of nihilism where there was no longer room for the notions of humanity, reason, and progress flourished as banners by the Enlightenment, and nihilism enveloped in a sinister apology for the divine order and absolutism. 1 century later, when counter-enlightenment entered into alliance with modern technology, this mixture of archaic mythology and destructive nihilism finally led to fascism. However, with the decisive and fatal conjunction of myth and steel, and of the irrationalism of the Welkisch ideology and the instrumental rationality of industry, the facade of de Maistre argumentation inevitably crumbled. The modernity of his vision of an order based on terror was concealed by a sacralization and heroization of the executioner, which upon close examination can be seen to have been already anachronistic at the time of the Soirées de St. Petersburg. In the French Revolution, the executioner was no longer the absolute master of the punitive ceremony, for he was replaced by the guillotine, the new symbol of sovereignty. The terrifying executioner with his royal axe left the stage, and his role was taken over by a machine alongside which he was no more than an attachment. 24. A technician, a manual worker. The new symbol of democratic justice was a technical device for dispensing death. The former executioner, who as Roger Cale Lewis explains was the counterpart to the splendor that surrounded the monarch, disappeared along with the latter. The monarch, once the possessor of two bodies, the eternal body of royalty and the mortal one of his own person, now forfeited not only his head but also the dignity and sacredness of a royal execution registered. The only privilege left to Louis XVI was the coach in which he was driven to the place of his execution instead of the tumbril usually provided for those condemned to death. His severed head, dripping with blood, was displayed as proof of the normality of his corpse. His death in no way differed from the deaths that had preceded it. His mechanical beheading on the altar of republican equality conferred upon him the status of an ordinary criminal. It is true that under the terror executions remained public, they were not yet carried out secretly and thus trivialized. The French Revolution represented precisely the moment of rupture in which the old sacrificial system celebrated its triumph one last time before disappearing forever, a moment when the ritualized violence of the past was unleashed within the social body that was on the point of exorcising it. Behind the spectacular and festive aspect of the deadly scene, the guillotine heralded a turning point. The Industrial Revolution entered the domain of capital punishment. Execution, henceforward mechanized and serialized, would soon cease to be a spectacle, a liturgy of suffering, and would instead become a technical process in the production line of death, a process that was impersonal, efficient, silent, and rapid. The ultimate result of this was the dehumanization of death. Demoted from the human race, men began to be slaughtered as though they were animals. At this point execution ceased to be what it had been under the Ancien Regime, a holocaust, a necessary sacrifice to glorify and legitimate royal sovereignty. The history of the guillotine provides a paradigmatic reflection of the dialectics of the Enlightenment. At the end of a huge social debate surrounding execution in which the medical body played a role of the first importance, the guillotine was the prize that the philosophes won in their struggle against the inhumanity of torture. For centuries, monarchies and the Church had expended their efforts on refining the instruments of the torturer in order to increase the suffering of their victims. Because it condensed execution into a single instant, almost eliminating the suffering of those condemned to death, the guillotine was hailed as progress for humanity and reason, an innovation that put an end to the inhumanity of torture and the political violence of the past, and thereby exorcised the specters of the massacres of St. Bartholomew's Day forever. At the time, even after the massive executions under the Terror, virtually no one had any inkling of the future effects of the rationalization and mechanization of the system of execution. The introduction of the guillotine also marked the emancipation of the executioner who, divested of the sinister aura that used to surround him, now obtained the status of citizen and, in 1790, became eligible to vote. Within 2 generations executioners were transformed into run-of-the-mill state employees. In 1840, the Gazette de Tribunaux described Monsieur Sanson, executioner under the July monarchy and the grandson of the last executioner of the Ancien Regime, The present executioner is very different from his father. When he speaks of his profession and the details surrounding it, he has none of the embarrassment and unease of his predecessor. Convinced of the utility of his duties and the service he provides for society, he no longer considers himself as anything more than an employee obeying orders, and refers to his functions with remarkable equanimity. 4 figures were involved in the success of this new instrument for killing: the doctor anxious to eliminate suffering for his fellow men, the engineer obsessed with technical efficiency, the judge who ruled on the right to live of those condemned, and the executioner resigned to abandoning his regal attributes and to donning the apparel of an ordinary professional. These 4 figures were to cover a long distance together. Under the Third Reich, they were to play an irreplaceable role in setting up and running Operation T4, euthanasia for the mentally ill and lives unworthy of living, preparing its structures, deciding to proceed with it, carrying it out, and defending it on the legal level when confronted by the relatives of its victims. The guillotine set in train a process that was to be illustrated, over a century later, by Kafka. The subject of his short story In the Penal Colony, written in the first few months of World War I, is a machine of both condemnation and execution whose features and technical perfection are described to the visitor by the officer in charge of it. It is true that this strange apparatus midway between the instruments of torture of the Middle Ages and the early industrial machines was still a symbol of sovereignty, for it engraves the law on the body of those condemned, but its conception and the way it functions introduce us into a completely new world. The officer of limited intelligence who is responsible for running it, who is indifferent to the fate of its victims and completely at the service of his machine, has become a mere manual worker, replaceable at any time. It is the apparatus that does the killing, all its keeper has to do is watch over it. Execution is a technical operation, and the machine's servant is responsible only for its upkeep. The killing takes place with no subject. No longer the defender of sovereignty, the executioner no longer symbolizes anything at all, no longer celebrates any public ceremony. He is merely a cog in a murderous process whose instrumental rationality makes it totally unremarkable. The rudimentary nature of the guillotine should not deceive us, it ushered in a new 27 era, the era of serialized death, which was soon to be run by a silent and anonymous army of minor officials of trivialized evil. Following Walter Benjamin, we could say the guillotine, which truly does represent an anthropological turning point, revealed the abyss of death without an aura. It marked the end of death as a spectacle, the end of the performance of the executioner artist, the end of the unique, sacred representation of terror, and the beginning of the era of modern massacres, when indirect execution, accomplished by technical means, eliminated the horror of visible violence and cleared the way for its infinite multiplication. In the age of industrial capitalism, the gas chambers were to be the means by which this principle was applied. The transformation of the executioner into the supervisor of a murderous machine implies a reversal of roles, the historical tendency of which was correctly grasped by Gunther Enders. Machines gained primacy over human beings. Soon even the most cruel and frenetic human violence would no longer be able to rival that of technology. With the technical dehumanization of death, the most inhuman crimes would become unmanned crimes. In the wake of Michel Foucault, numerous historians have analyzed the process by which, in the course of the 19th century, the punitive festival came to be replaced by secret executions, out of sight of the public, and by the rise of the prison as a place of confinement, a laboratory for developing techniques for the coercion of individuals unknown up until then. The principle of confinement was now forced upon Western societies. Alongside the introduction of modern prisons came the creation of institutions of forced labor for lazy vagabonds, the poor, the marginal, and prostitutes and, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, even for children. During the first half of the 19th century, Great Britain built a vast network of workhouses in which hundreds of thousands of people were interned. Other changes were also introduced at this time. Barracks, no longer the preserve of an aristocratic military elite, were adapted to the needs of modern armies, the armies of the democratic age, the full power of which had been demonstrated by the mass levying of troops of 1793. Factories, around which new towns were built, sprang up with impressive speed. These prisons, barracks, and factories were all dominated by the same principle of enclosure, the same imposition of discipline upon time and bodies, the same rational division and mechanization of labor, a social hierarchy, and the same submission of bodies to machines. Each of these institutions testified to the degradation of work and bodies that was an inherent feature of capitalism. First Marx and Engels, then Max Weber likened the discipline of the capitalist factory to that of the army, and workers to soldiers. In the early days of industrial capitalism, the authors of the Communist Manifesto noted the new face of this disciplinarian society: masses of laborers, crowded into the factory, are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. In the chapter on Machines in Capital, Book 1, Marx goes further. He describes modern factories as places of a systematic dispossession of the workers' conditions of life and, quoting the social theorist Charles Fourier, compared them to mitigated prisons. Registered on the eve of World War I, Weber saw military discipline as typical of big capitalist enterprises. Degree considered retrospectively, Jeremy Bentham's scheme for a model prison, the Panopticon, looks like the forerunner of a new system of social control. And for the disciplining of bodies, conceived as a model of repressive transparency that was valid for society as a whole. In a note to his Panopticon, Bentham indicated the many possible applications of his model, which he considered to be useful for factories and schools as well as for prisons. His project can be situated midway between the utilitarian vision of a house of correction, typical of Protestant countries, and the coercive and disciplinarian prison of modern industrial society. Point 2. The panoptic device was intended to be both a center of production and also a place for the training of minds and bodies in order to subjugate them to the new mechanical gods of the capitalist economy. This new type of prison was developed during the first phase of industrial capitalism, when the laboring classes turned 21 and penal establishments became into the dangerous classes filled with a heterogeneous population made up of social figures refractory to the new disciplinary models, whether vagabonds or prostitutes, pilferers or drunkards. On the one hand, resistance to the factory system and the dislocation of rural communities had considerably broadened the spectrum of social marginality, criminality, and consequently the prison population. On the other hand, the advent of machines had radically diminished the value of forced labor. In this context, prisons underwent a veritable metamorphosis, marked by the massive reintroduction of punitive measures and degrading practices. The retributive concept of justice and the utilitarian vision of prisons encouraged by the philosophers of the Enlightenment now gave way to a vision of prison as a place of suffering and alienation. The dialectic of this process was already prefigured by the reception given in Europe to a classic pamphlet by Cesare Beccaria on crimes and punishments. In this manifesto against torture and capital punishment, Beccaria pleads for the right of the accused to a fair trial and defends the principle of an expiatio that would redeem those sentenced to prison. However, the debate that the pamphlet prompted in Europe centered above all on the rational exploitation of prison labor. The French mathematician Pierre-Louis Maupertuis and the Piedmontese economist Guillaume Battista Vasco even suggested that detainees should be used as guinea pigs for medical experiments. As Franco Venturi writes, the whole debate on prisons at the end of the 18th century was marked by a convergence of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, economic calculations, and something more alarming, an ancient cruelty that now took on new, more rational forms. Prisons preserved the authoritarian rationality of factories and barracks but changed their function. Prison work was no longer conceived as a source of profit but as a punishment and a method of torture. Detainees were obliged to move huge rocks from place to place, eventually returning them to their original position, or to spend entire days pumping water back to its source. In 1818, William Cubitt constructed a treadmill that, having been tested in the Suffolk prison, served as a model for many other British penal institutions. A French observer, Baron de Pan, had produced an admiring description of these, smiley face, English penal wheels, recommending their use in his own country. They consisted of a number of cylinders of varying diameter, moved by the prisoners walking inside them for hours on end. According to the calculations of the organizers of the English penal system, truly the precursors of the physiology of labor, this activity corresponded to climbing several thousand meters per day. The system was sometimes applied to productive tasks such as grinding wheat or spinning cotton, but was more often described simply as a torture. It was a synthesis of discipline that was both panoptic and also mechanical, forcing submission of the body by the technical constraints of this punitive tool, and it pushed the order of a factory to its logical limits, usually diso. 31 plus discipline, punishing, killing, cheating it from any productive end. The reformer Robert Pearson had elaborated a program designed to use terror to deter the popular classes from crime, to tame the most savage of animals. We deprive them of sleep, and there is no criminal who does not feel the greatest repugnance for the monotony of a life that allows him little sleep and forces him to respect a timetable laid down in advance. I propose that he sleep on a hard bed rather than in a soft hammock, that he be fed a minimal ration of thick bread and water, that he wear coarse, loudly patterned clothing. I have no sympathy with the kind of humanity that panders to the prisoner's noble sentiments by rejecting prison uniform. A uniform is indispensable for reasons of security, to make them distinguishable. To my mind, one of the requirements of a healthy system of penal discipline is that those condemned to prison should wear a uniform. As a consequence of the spread of these repressive measures, a considerable rise in the prison mortality rate became noticeable in all European countries. In an analysis of the conditions in the Clairvaux prison under the July monarchy, Michel Peroux had no hesitation in using the expression quasi-genocide. The prisons of the early 19th century, in which the labor was conceived purely for the purpose of persecution and humiliation and usually for no productive end, were the forerunners of the modern concentration camp system. Primo Levi described the labor in Auschwitz as a mythical and dantesque torment of body and spirit, the sole purpose of which was to affirm totalitarian dominance. He went on to note that this disciplinarian and punitive concept was the very antithesis of the creative work praised by fascist and Nazi propaganda, a legacy of the bourgeois rhetoric that exalted work as an ennobling activity. If the treadmill of the Suffolk prison does have anything in common with the labor of the Nazi camps, it lies in what Primo Levi defined, in the drowned and the saved, as widespread, useless violence, as an end in itself, with the sole purpose of creating pain. A number of principles upon which the workhouses of the 19th century were based reappear in the concentration camps of the following century: the confined place, the coerced labor, the useless violence, the military type of discipline, the punishments, the total absence of liberty, the uniform, the exhaustion of bodies, the inhuman living conditions, and the humiliation. In Capital, Marx describes the English workhouses as houses of terror and considered those reserved for children to be the theatres of a great massacre of innocents. Of course, to compare those two institutions, stressing their morphological affinity, is not to equate them. Their final aims were substantially different, on the one hand, to train, on the other, to annihilate. The Nazi camps were not simply harsher prisons with more highly perfected coercive techniques, they were a new phenomenon serving a different logic. The comparison nevertheless retains a heuristic value, as Wolfgang Sofsky puts it, to the extent that it illustrates the transformation of human labor into labor of terror. In other words, the world of the concentration camps presupposes an earlier, preliminary stage, that of the modern prison, which occurred at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Excursus on the Nazi concentration camp system. After the failure of the Blitzkrieg in the East, Germany progressively became a modern slavery-based system, which Franz Neumann has described as a form of totalitarian monopolistic capitalism, as it threw a massive force of foreign labor into the war economy. Speer masterminded a rationalization of industrial production based on the forced labor of foreigners. Apart from a minority of anti-fascist or asocial Germans, forced labor constituted a heterogeneous 33 degrees. NEAS army comprising civilians from the occupied countries, prisoners of war, and deportees. In 1944, this foreign labor force numbered more than 7.6 million people and made up roughly 1/4 of the industrial working class. At this time, inmates of the concentration camps were also working for German industry. In April 1942, the Nazis decided to place the concentration camps under the direction of the SS's Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungsamt, the Economic and Administrative Central Office, under Oswald Pohl, assigning it the task of rendering the hitherto purely punitive and disciplinary work of the inmates productive. In the concentration camps, the SS rented out the prisoner of war and deportee workforce to a number of German companies, which thus had at their disposal a vast supply of forced labor, at very low cost, whenever they needed it. Many large businesses set up their production lines inside the camps, and at the same time concentration camps were mushrooming around industrial sites. In 1944, about half the concentration camp inmates were working for private industry, and the remainder worked for the THIRD organization, which was responsible for the production of armaments. Registered the top stratum of this army of foreign workers consisted of civilians from the occupied countries in Western Europe. Next came the prisoners of war from Western Europe. Lower down was the mass of Untermenschen, Soviet and Polish prisoners of war, who were heavily exploited and destined for rapid annihilation. At the very bottom was the small minority of deported Jews and Gypsies who had been selected for labor and thus had escaped the gas chambers. The prisoners of war and the political and racial deportees were subjected to conditions of modern slavery that might perhaps be termed a form of biologicalized Taylorism. In accordance with the Taylor paradigm, the workforce was segmented and 34. Hierarchized on the basis of the various functions in the production process and, as in slavery, the alienation of the workers was total. Unlike in classical slavery, however, the deportees did not constitute a labor force that was intended to reproduce itself but was supposed to be worked to exhaustion and death, within the framework of a system of veritable extermination through work. Finally, in accordance with the Nazi worldview, the division of labor coincided with a racial cleavage that determined the internal hierarchy of this category of slave workers. Superimposed upon the professional stratification of the proletariat that was inherent to industrial capitalism was a racial stratification dictated by the Nazi system of values, which implied a radical rejection of the principle of equality. Nazi biopolitics fused industrial modernity and counter-enlightenment. This was Taylorism rethought within a capitalism remodeled according to racist principles. Once the values of 1798 had been buried, the entire existence of the Nazi concentration camps was marked by a constant tension between work and extermination. Initially designed as punitive centers, then, during the war, transformed into centers of production, they became de facto centers of extermination through work. This contradiction, linked with the polycratic Nazi system of power, was expressed on the one hand by the totalitarian rationalization of the economy pushed through by Albert Speer and on the other by the racial order elaborated by Himmler. An illustration of this conflict is provided by the ambivalent status of the extermination camps, which were conceived not as places of production but as centers for the extermination of the Jews of Europe, yet which nevertheless remained under the jurisdiction of the WVHA. As for the result of this tension between work and death, we should remember the observations of André Sellier, an ex-deportee and historian of the Dora camp, close to Buchenwald, which was created for the production, in and on 35 degrees discipline, punishing, killing. Underground factory, of the famous V2S with which Hitler intended to bring Great Britain to its knees. Sellier declares that in Dora, the production of corpses in and for the factory was always more efficient than the fabrication of V2S. Factories and the division of labor. If the guillotine marked the first step toward the serialization of methods of execution, Auschwitz represents its industrial epilogue in the age of Fordist capitalism. But the transition between the two was long drawn out. A number of intermediary stages separate the mechanical chopper used for capital executions in the aftermath of 1789 and the industrialized extermination of millions of human beings. The most important was probably the rationalization of abattoirs, in the second half of the 19th century. These had originally been located in town centers, but were now moved further afield, in accordance with the prescriptions of a hygiene policy designed to sanitize urban centers. The removal of the abattoirs coincided with a policy of concentration which led to a drastic reduction in their number. The abattoir, a telling symptom of the newfound sensitivity and growing intolerance toward external manifestations of violence, testified to an anthropological mutation that Alain Corbin describes as a transition from the Dionysiac impulses of traditional slaughtering to the pasteurized carnage of the modern age. The transfer of slaughterhouses away from town centers coincided with their rationalization. They now began to function as veritable factories. Examples are provided by the abattoirs of La Villette, in Paris, conceived by Baron Haussmann and inaugurated in 1867, and above all by the new abattoirs of Chicago, which expanded at an impressive rate in the course of just a few decades. Animals were now slaughtered as if on a production line, in a strictly rationalized sequence of procedures, collection in Count 36. Sheds, slaughtering, evisceration, waste disposal. No aliviales perceptibly seized upon the features of industrial abattage, it runs on a massive scale and anonymous, technical, and, ideally, non-existent. It has to seem as though it does not happen. Even the term abattoir, a semantic innovation of the period, was designed to exorcise all images of violence. To use the term abattoir was to avoid words such as butchering or slaughtering. In the Jungle, a naturalistic novel contemporary with Weber's essay on the Protestant ethic, the American writer Upton Sinclair said of the abattoirs of Chicago, "It was the great butcher, it was the spirit of capitalism made flesh." Asterisk. And Siegfried Kracauer, in his theory of film, seized upon the analogy between abattoirs and death camps, using a comparison between documentaries on the Nazi camps and a film such as Georges Frange's Les Sang de Bêtes to underline the remarkable similarity between the methodical nature of the slaughtering machinery and the geometrical organization of the space used. Basically, he pointed out, the Nazi lager were abattoirs where humans classed as subhuman were killed like animals. The historian Henry Friedlander also stressed that affinity when he described the Nazi extermination camps as abattoirs for human beings. We do not know whether Hitler had abattoirs in mind when he decided upon the final solution, but the architects and engineers of the Topf company in Erfurt, which designed the cremation furnaces of Auschwitz, must certainly have thought of them. The camps functioned as death factories, removed from the gaze of the public, where the mass production of merchandise was replaced by the industrial production and elimination of corpses. Following Taylorist principles of scientific management, in order to maximize efficiency, the execution system was separated into several stages: concentration, deportation, the seizure of the victim's possessions, the recuperation of certain parts of their bodies, gassing, and incin. 37 plus discipline, punishing, killing. Eration of the corpses. The directors of the extermination camps were well aware of their typically industrial structure. An Auschwitz SS doctor accurately described it as working like a production line. And when questioned by Claude Lanzmann, the ex-SS man Franz Suchamel agreed that Treblinka was a production line of death, a primitive one, admittedly, but it functioned well. Asterisk. With its industrial methods of execution, Auschwitz thus presents essential affinities with a factory, as is quite clear from its architecture, with its chimneys and sheds aligned in symmetrical rows and its position at the center of an industrial zone and an important railway junction. Production and extermination were indistinguishable, as if massacre was simply a particular form of production, no different from the manufacture of synthetic rubber for which Bunamanowice, Auschwitz III, had been created. In the morning the convoys arrived and discharged their cargo of deported Jews. SS doctors made their selection. Once those suitable for work were picked out, the other deportees were stripped of their possessions and sent to the gas chambers, By the evening they had already been incinerated, their clothes, suitcases, spectacles, and so on were sifted and stocked in storage huts, as were certain parts of their bodies, such as hair and gold teeth. In his memoirs, Philipp Miller, a member of an Auschwitz Sonderkommando, or special detachment, left a precise description of the way an Auschwitz crematorium functioned. The long hall of perhaps some 160 square meters in area was full of a cloud of smoke and vapor that caught in one's throat. Two large groups of rectangular furnaces, each with 4 combustion chambers, stood in the middle of the room. Between the furnaces were the generators in which the fire was *38 lit and fed. Coke brought in wheelbarrows was used to heat the furnaces. Masses of flames escaped into the air through 2 underground channels that linked the furnaces to the huge chimneys. The violence of the flames and the blaze was such that everything groaned and shook. A number of detainees covered in soot and dripping with sweat would be busy scraping out one of the furnaces to rid it of an incandescent, whitish substance. This had gathered in streaks that had become increased instead on the concrete floor, beneath the furnace grill. As soon as this mass cooled a little, it turned whitish gray. It was the ashes of men who had still been living a few hours earlier and had departed this world after an atrocious martyrdom that bothered nobody. While the ashes were being scraped from one group of furnaces, the ventilators of the adjacent group were lit and all was made ready for the next delivery. A number of corpses already lay on the bare concrete floor, all around *degree. As in a tailorist factory, the distribution of tasks was coordinated with the rationalization of the timing. A team of workers had just a few minutes to incinerate the corpses while a member of the Sonderkommando, a timekeeper, ensured that the rhythm was sustained. While the corpses were being burned, Miller adds, we would be preparing the next furnace batch. This picture of work at Auschwitz, something in between the photographs in Louis Hein's Men at Work and Hieronymus Bosch's Hell, represents a process that the SS and the technicians of the top organization had spent several months planning and testing. Although the logic behind the extermination camps was clearly not that of a capitalist firm since the product was not merchandise but corpses, the same structures and methods as those of a factory were adopted. Gunther Anders has observed. 39. That the task of the death camps was to convert men into raw material, and that this industrial massacre was not carried out like a slaughter of human beings in the traditional sense of the expression, but rather as a production of corpses. It may be helpful at this point to return to the above-cited analogy with Taylorism, of which, basically, Auschwitz was simply a sinister caricature-like variant. A number of the fundamental principles for the scientific organization of factories that had been elaborated by Frederick W. Taylor were strictly applied. These included the workers' total submission to those in command, a strict separation between the organization and the execution of tasks, disqualifications, and hierarchization for the workforce, and the segmentation of production into a series of operations controlled solely by those in command. The separation of the worker from the means of production was one of the historical conditions of modern capitalism, but Taylorism over and above this introduced the dissociation of workers from control of the work process, thereby opening up the path for serial production in the Ford mode. In American industry, which became a widely followed example in Europe, after World War I, this meant replacing the old skilled working class with working masses, unskilled and always replaceable. Taylor's ideal worker was an unthinking one, with no intellectual autonomy and capable only of mechanically accomplishing standardized operations, in his own words, an ox or an intelligent gorilla. In short, a dehumanized, alienated being, an automaton. In his Americanism and Fordism, Antonio Gramsci describes the worker of a factory on the Taylor model as a being in whom the psychophysical link that had always determined working conditions and that demanded a measure of the active participation of intelligence, imagination, and initiative had been broken. Now, the concept of the Sonderkommandos, which were made 40 up of deportees, who were responsible for carrying out all the tasks linked with the killing process, obviously implied the workers' total alienation from the work that they carried out. And that was a notion inherent in the Taylorist paradigm. The extermination camp Sonderkommandos were a sinister epitome of this notion. Primo Levi regarded the concept of the Sonderkommandos as National Socialism's most demonic crime, an attempt to shift the burden of guilt onto others, specifically the victims, so that they were deprived of even the solace of innocence. It is true that Taylor never imagined quite such an abyss of viciousness, but those who conceived the gas chambers were certainly familiar with modern methods for the organization of labor and industrial production. Through an irony of history, the theories of Frederick Taylor, who conceived of the scientific organization of factories as a means of increasing production and superseding the old military way of organizing industrial work, were eventually applied by a totalitarian system and put to serve the end not production but extermination. In the worlds of Taylor and the anti-Semitic Henry Ford, Nazism found the wherewithal to fuel both its urge to dominate and its community-oriented aspirations. The dehumanization of workers now targeted the Untermenschen. The union of capital and labor was the cornerstone of Aryan Volksgemeinschaft, or community of the folk. In this sense, the members of the Sonderkommandos certainly did not embody the ideal worker as promoted by the 41 plus discipline, punishing, killing Nazi Weltanschauung, but did satisfy the latter's destructive urge. Destined to die like all the gas deportees, the slave laborers personified a new figure created by the camps, one that Jean Amory has called dehumanized man. Meanwhile, work itself was exalted by Nazism as a creative, spiritual activity, as illustrated by the novelist Ernst Jünger's Arbeiter and the Ferdinand Steiger painting Werk Soldaten. The mission of the German worker was to build the Thousand-Year Reich. He was supposed to herald the new man. Work, conceived as an act at once aesthetic and creative, a redemptive act in contrast to the occupations of the Jews, which were considered parasitic and mercenary by definition, was the means to achieve this. Institutions such as Kraft der Freude and, within it, Schönheit der Arbeit were designed to mitigate the effects of the rationalization of production by limiting or counterbalancing its more alienating aspects by means of palliative measures such as hot meals, clean workshops, sporting and recreational activities, organized vacations, and so on. In short, the relation of Nazism to Taylorism and Fordism was always marked by a certain ambivalence. Although the principles of both had since World War I been applied to German industry as elsewhere in Europe and were admired by Hitler and the Nazi engineers, they were rejected as anti-German by the directors of the Deutsches Institut für Technische Arbeitsschulung, the German Institute for Technical Vocational Training. Bureaucratic administration. Like all business enterprises, a factory that produced death was run by a rational administration based upon the principles of calculation, specialization, and the segmentation of tasks into a series of partial, seemingly independent yet coordinated opera 42. The agents of this bureaucratic apparatus did not control the process as a whole, and when they did learn of its final purpose they could justify themselves by saying that they had borne no responsibility and were simply obeying orders, or else that their own limited and partial function was in itself in no way criminal. Max Weber realized that moral indifference constituted an essential feature of modern bureaucracy, which was specialized and therefore irreplaceable, but separated from the means of work and unaffected by the final outcome of its actions. In Economy and Society he sketched in the following picture. When fully developed, bureaucracy also stands, in a specific sense, under the principle of sine IRAAC studio. Bureaucracy develops the more perfectly the more it is dehumanized, the more completely it succeeds in eliminating from official business degree *48. Races and of the decadence of civilization to the later elaborations of Georges Vacher de Lapoge and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose writings were already deeply contaminated by social Darwinism, medical anthropology, eugenics, and racial biology. The racists of the late 19th century rejected Gobineau's resignation in the face of the decadence of the West, in which Arendt detected a projection of the decline of the European aristocracy, and recommended new therapies that were to be tried out for the first time in the colonial world, including the selection of races and the extermination of conquered peoples, which was represented as the natural law of historical development. It was precisely this desire to regenerate, this aspiration toward a new world order and new relations of domination between people, that marked the transition from an ideology of decadence to vitalism, from an apology for the traditional order to a cult of technical modernity as the source of conquest and power, in other words, that favored the move from conservatism to fascism. Biological racism and colonialism now surged forward together, bolstered by two complementary types of discourse, one that promoted Europe's civilizing mission and the other that encouraged the extinction of inferior races, conquest through extermination. In 1876, King Leopold II of Belgium produced an inspired panegyric of colonialism in which all the commonplaces of the Eurocentric spirit of the 19th century found expression. To open up to civilization the only part of our globe that it has not yet penetrated, to pierce the darkness that envelopes entire populations, that I dare to claim is a crusade worthy of an age of progress. Carl Schmitt cited this passage in Der Nomos der Erde, interpreting it as the crowning ambition of the Jus Publicum Europaeum, of which international law was simply an extension and which quite naturally authorized wars of conquest outside Europe. Many traces of such a vision of the world are detectable in classic liberalism. John Stuart Mill, who was also a director of the East India Company, explained at the beginning of his famous essay on liberty, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. In Principles of Political Economy, Mill stressed that the West Indies were not countries in the Western sense of the term, but the place where England finds it convenient to carry on the production of sugar, coffee, and a few other tropical commodities. Alexis de Tocqueville, who certainly saluted the aristocratic pride of the Indian tribes of America and deplored their massacre, nevertheless declared that they occupied that continent but did not possess it. They lived amid the riches of the New World like temporary residents, as if Providence had afforded them no more than a short-term use of it. Tocqueville went on to say that they were simply there waiting to be replaced by the Europeans, the legitimate proprietors of the land. In his correspondence he suggested that the westward expansion of the United States was a model for the colonization of Algeria, registered where total domination was the natural goal of the French armies, in comparison to which the destruction of villages and the massacre of their Arab populations were merely regrettable necessities. Edward Said and Michael Adas are right to stress that the colonial culture is not just a form of propaganda and that the imperialist ideology should be taken seriously. 19th century Europe was truly convinced that it was accomplishing a civilizing mission in Asia and Africa. At the time of decolonization, the imperialist culture was stigmatized, violently rejected, and subsequently forgotten. It never became the subject of in-depth analysis, and today remains still largely repressed. Yet the intelligibility of the 20th century would be considerably enhanced if that amnesia lifted, for then the link between National Socialism and classic imperialism would no longer be obscured as it is at present. To several analysts of the 50s, 30s and 40s, however, it was certainly perfectly clear. Ernst Jünger was reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as a Wehrmacht officer in Paris in 1942. Contemporary events conferred a definite topicality upon this tale about the colonization of the Congo, which described the switch from a civilizing optimism to total bestiality. In his diary, Jünger noted that the story's hero had recognized the strains of the overture to Our Century. In 1942, Karl Korsch, a German Marxist philosopher then in exile in the United States, attempted a historical interpretation of the violence of the war which called the global dynamic of the West into question. The novelty of totalitarian politics in this respect is simply that the Nazis have extended to civilized European peoples the methods hitherto reserved for the natives or savages living outside so-called civilization. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, a work published in 1951 but containing several texts written during the war years, Hannah Arendt identified European imperialism as an essential stage in the genesis of Nazism. The episodes of 19th-century colonial violence seemed to her to prefigure the crimes that were perpetrated a century later against Europeans, particularly the Jews, who were the victims of a genocide conceived as an operation of racial purging. In Part 2 of her book, titled Imperialism, She described the 19th-century policies of colonial domination as the first synthesis between massacre and administration, a synthesis of which, in her view, the Nazi camps produced the ultimate form. Modern racism and bureaucracy originated separately but evolved along parallel lines. They came together in Africa. The conquest of this continent, achieved with modern weaponry and planned by the military and civilian bureaucracy, revealed a hitherto unprecedented potential for violence. Arendt used a striking expression at this point. She wrote of administrative massacres that, it seemed to her, prefigured the Nazi extermination camps. When the European mob discovered what a lovely virtue a white skin could be in Africa, when the English conqueror in India became an administrator who no longer believed in the universal validity of law, but was convinced of his own innate capacity to rule and dominate. The stage seemed to be set for all possible horrors. Lying under anybody's nose were many of the elements which, gathered together, could create a totalitarian government on the basis of racism. Administrative massacres were proposed by Indian bureaucrats, while African officials declared that no ethical considerations such as the rights of man will be allowed to stand in the way of the white rule. Asterisk. The notion of living space was not a Nazi invention. It was simply the German version of a commonplace of European culture at the time of imperialism, in the same way as Malthusianism was in Great Britain. The idea of a living space inspired a policy of conquest and was invoked to justify the goals of Pan-Germanism. Meanwhile, Malthusian theories were regularly used to legitimate famine in India, which some observers of the time accepted as a salutary cure for overpopulation. The concept of living space, as much as the population principle, postulated a hierarchy in the right to existence, which became the prerogative of the nations, or even races, that were dominant. The expression Lebensraum was coined in Ergo I, under Kaiser Wilhelm, by the German geographer Friedrich Ratzel and had become part of the vocabulary of German nationalism well before the advent of Nazism. It resulted from the fusion of social Darwinism and imperialist geopolitics, and stemmed from a vision of the extra-European world as a space to be colonized by biology. 52. Kali superior groups. For Ratzel, the living space was essential in order to re-establish a balance, in Germany, between the industrial development, which was by now irreversible, and agriculture, which was thereby threatened. In their colonies, the Germans would re-establish harmonious relations with nature and preserve their vocation as a people wedded to the land. Under the empire of Kaiser Wilhelm, the idea of Lebensraum inspired a current of Pan-Germanism and was the basis for a widespread demand for a Weltpolitik, international policy, that would assign Germany an international position comparable to that of France and Great Britain. The expectation that this would be brought about by a policy of colonial expansion in the East, in a world populated by Untermenschen, was taken for granted by many nationalist Germans as early as the end of the 19th century, when the notions of Middle Africa and Middle Europa started to be associated as two indissociable aspects of German foreign policy. The symptoms of a vision of the world such as this, which attributed a civilizing mission in Eastern Europe to the Germans, are easily detectable in the work not only of Heinrich von Treitschke but also of the young Max Weber. The Altdeutscher Verbund, founded in 1893, was the central dispenser of propaganda for this colonial project. By the end of the 19th century, several of its representatives had elaborated plans for a Germanization of the Slavic world, which in some cases implied marginalizing, in others expelling non-Germanic populations. Some of these plans, for example those elaborated in the geographer Paul Langhans's Ein pangermanistisches Deutschland, were linked to legal measures of racist if not eugenic inspiration that paved the way for the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. During World War I, all the necessary conditions for beginning to apply these pan-German programs seemed to be in place. At 53*. The time of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, which officialized the modification of the eastern frontiers, the German government had envisaged a policy for the Germanization of the occupied territories, accompanied by the enforced displacement of some Slav populations. Under the Weimar Republic, Following the amputations inflicted upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, those claims were to be revised and radicalized by the National Socialists, who reformulated them in racist terms in an aggressively imperialistic program. In the early 20s, the Völkisch writer Hans Grimm produced a novel titled Vok ohne Raum, which popularized the idea of living space and was extremely successful. In his novel, Grimm, who would join the German National Socialist Workers' Party in 1930, recounted the tale of Freibad, a German who had traveled to German West Africa and who, having helped to repress a native revolt, remade his life far from all industrialized towns, in contact with a still uncontaminated nature that was a replacement for the German forests that were already surrounded by factory chimneys and crisscrossed by motorways. Needless to say, the corollary to this Germanic paradise in southwest Africa was the strictest racial segregation. In 1920, the last German governor in Africa, Heinrich Schnee, organized the production of an ambitious Deutsches Koloniallexikon in 3 volumes, to which he contributed an article entitled Verkofferung, meaning the regression of Europeans to the cultural level of a native. In order to prevent such degeneration as a result of life in the bush, contact with colored peoples, and, above all, sexual relations with the indigenous population which would inevitably lead to diminished intelligence and lower productivity, Schnee advocated a regime of racial segregation. 2. The Nuremberg laws of the Nazis shocked the Europe of the 1930s because they were directed 54. Against a group, Jews, that had been emancipated for a whole century and that was perfectly well integrated into German society and culture. Yet the entire club of colonial powers had already envisaged such laws as normal and natural measures to be taken with regard to the non-European world. There exists a vast bibliography relating to the history of anti-Semitism in Germany and Hitler's ideological ancestors and theoretical sources of inspiration, ranging from Richard Wagner to Arthur Moeller van den Broek, and from Wilhelm Marr to Houston Stewart Chamberlain. But very few works attempt to explain the Nazi crimes in the light of both German and more generally European colonial cultures and practices. Emphasis is placed on the specific features of Nazi anti-Semitism but not on its roots in a theory and practice of extermination of inferior races to which all the imperial Western powers subscribed. The extinction of races. In the Western culture of the 19th century, colonialism, a civilizing mission, the rites of conquest, and practices of extermination were frequently virtually synonymous terms. A vast literature, partly scientific and partly popular, made up of scholarly works, anthropological reviews, travelers' tales, and novels and stories aimed at both the educated and the working classes fostered belief in the principle of the West's right to dominate the world, to colonize the planet, and to subjugate or even eliminate savage peoples. Where colonization involved the total eradication of native populations, as in the United States, that principle was affirmed most explicitly. In 1850, at the height of the stampede to grab lands in the West, the American anthropologist Robert Knox declared in The Race of Man that extermination was, quite simply, a law of Anglo-Saxon America. Asterisk. Such frankness was less frequent. 55 asterisk. Among the scholars of Victorian England, who preferred to refer to the matter in terms of the extinction of inferior races. Around the middle of the 19th century, this idea became integrated into European culture as an established fact, which social Darwinism then set out to prove at a scientific level. The ethos of triumphant capitalism was a mixture, in varying proportions, of the ideas of Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, Charles Darwin, Auguste Comte, and Herbert Spencer, in other words a combination of laissez-faire economics, the population principle, the theory of natural selection, positivist determinism, and evolutionism. It richly deserved the definition that Lukács was to give it, a pseudo-biological defense of class privileges. One of the great discoveries of this ethos was the extinction of inferior races, and this was one of its favorite subjects of debate. In 1864 it was the theme of a discussion organized by the London Anthropological Society, in which imperialism was provided with theoretically solid scientific basis, accompanied by a substantial dose of Victorian moralizing. The debate opened with a report from Dr. Richard Lee, who, drawing on the example of New Zealand, remarked upon the rapid disappearance of Aboriginal tribes in the face of the advance of civilization, from which he concluded that Europe may have for her destiny to repopulate the globe. Lee explained that the high mortality rate among the Maoris and Polynesians was certainly partly a result of diseases introduced by the Europeans, but claimed that there were deeper causes for the phenomenon. He concluded, "We must regard it as an illustration of the crudest forms of humanity, with certain groups shrinking and passing away before others that are enlightened with intelligence and endowed with intellectual superiority." Thomas Bendichet, a theorist of the natural selection of races, made a contribution to the discussion in which he cited an American social Darwinist, a Professor Waits, according to whom we should not simply acknowledge **. 56. Edge the right of the white American to destroy the red man, but perhaps give him credit for having acted as the instrument of providence in carrying out and promoting the law of destruction. Bendichet then added some general remarks relating to the American experience. Some morbid philanthropists, who have formed associations for the preservation of these races, attribute their extinction to the aggression by fire and sword inflicted upon them by the settlers, and the deadly diseases that the latter introduce. Although to some extent this may be the case, it simply confirms the effects of a more powerful law that dictates the inferior race will eventually be swallowed up by the superior. Alfred Russel Wallace, along with Darwin, the founder of the idea of natural selection, also contributed to the debate. He reaffirmed the same law of the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, the inevitable consequence of which is the extinction of all those low and mentally undeveloped populations with which Europeans come into contact. As he saw it, this law explained the disappearance of the Indians in North America and Brazil and of the Tasmanians, Maoris, and other indigenous populations in Australia and New Zealand. He went on to produce a biological justification of imperialism. The intellectual and moral, as well as the physical, qualities of the European are superior, the same powers and capacities which have made him rise in a few centuries from the condition of a wandering savage, with a scanty and stationary population, to his present stage of culture and advancement, with a greater average longevity, a greater average strength, and a capacity of more rapid increase enable him, when in contact with the savage man, to conquer in the struggle for existence, and to increase at his expense, just as the better adapted increase at the expense of the less adapted varieties in 57 degrees. The animal and vegetable kingdoms, just as the weeds of Europe overrun North America and Australia, extinguishing native productions by the inherent vigor of their organization, and by their greater capacity for existence and multiplication. A few years later, Wallace was to develop his ideas on the extinction of inferior races in a chapter of his Natural Selection, in which he even predicted the conclusion of the process in a distant but foreseeable future, when the world is again inhabited by a single, nearly homogeneous race. The British anthropologist Benjamin Kidd declared in Social Evolution, one of the most widely diffused late 19th 29th century summaries of social Darwinism, that it was utterly pointless for the white man to demonstrate his philanthropic virtues and his Christian ethics, since it was despite himself, thanks to an anthropological and historical law as inevitable as it was pitiless, that he was causing the end of the savage peoples. Whenever a superior race comes into close contact and competition with an inferior race, the result seems to be much the same, whether reached by the rude methods of wars and conquest, the subtle, though no less efficient, methods with the 39 so no purpose was which science makes us acquainted, served by attempts to elucidate the causes of the extinction. Needless to say, the discourse of the British naturalists was matched by their colleagues in France, where social Darwinism exerted considerable influence on the development of anthropology. In 1888, Edmund Purrier wrote, "Human races owe their spread on earth to their superiority. Just as animals disappear before the advance of man, this privileged being, so too the savage is wiped out before the European, before civilization ever takes hold of him. However regrettable this may be from a moral point of view, civilization degree *58. Seems to have spread throughout the world far more by dint of destroying the barbarians than by subjecting them to its laws. It was Tasmania, the smallest of the Australian islands, that, toward the end of the 19th century, focused the fantasies of the imperialist culture. Edifying proof of this is provided by a book called The Last of the Tasmanians, in which James Bonnock, a sort of Bartolomeo de las Casas of the Victorian age, recorded the various versions of the apology for genocide purveyed by the colonial press and literature of the time, the demographic decline of populations brought about by the arrival of the colonists, with all their unknown viruses and infections, the effect of which was to propagate epidemics and cause sterility, was inevitably interpreted by Western observers as confirmation of selectionist theories. An abundant literature in the main European languages set about introducing scientific categories for codifying the law of the fatal impact of civilization upon savages. It was without doubt a demographic law that M. Marais Tang was attempting to prove in the Revue Scientifique in 1892. All inferior peoples put in contact with a superior people are fatally condemned to perish. In 1G09, E. Cailliot was writing along the same lines in a work entitled Les Polynésiens orientaux au contact de la civilisation. When a people has remained stationary for so long, all hope of seeing it advance must be abandoned. It is bound to be classified among the inferior nations and, like these, is condemned to die out or be absorbed by a superior race. That is the implacable law of nature against which nothing can prevail, as has repeatedly been established by history. The stronger devours the weaker. The Polynesian race did not manage to scale the rungs of the ladder of progress. It has added not the slightest contribution to the efforts that humanity has made to 59 degrees. Prove its lot. It must therefore make way before others that are more worthy, and disappear. Its death will be no loss to civilization. The writings of Darwin are not altogether free of Eurocentric features of this kind, and there can be no doubt that, right from the first, Origins of Species was regarded as the decisive scientific justification for imperialistic practices. It is now generally accepted that Darwin cannot be considered responsible for social Darwinism because of the affiliation that its representatives claim, using terms that are in many cases exaggerated or even distorting. However, to postulate a total separation between the two would be equally false. Despite its rejection of polygenesis theories of the origin of the species, the Darwinian view of the extra-European world was, as André Picot puts it, a singular, basically very Victorian mixture of the morality of the catechism and an utterly soulless colonialist racism. Darwin always shared his own age's dominant view of inferior races, which were regarded as living fossils, vestiges of a past destined to disappear as civilization progressed. In his notebook we find a passage dated December 1838 that would not have been out of place in Mein Kampf. When two races of men meet, they act precisely like two species of animals. They fight, eat each other, bring diseases to each other, but then comes the most deadly struggle, namely which have the best fitted organization, or instincts to gain the day. The following year, he noted in his diary a mysterious factor: wherever the European settles, death seems to persecute the aborigine. This is a reference to a Western stereotype that Darwin did not invent but that he did not manage to avoid, and that recurs constantly in those of his works that preceded the elaboration of his theory of natural selection. The theory, however, then enabled him to convert that Miss 60 Rias factor to which he had alluded in 1839 into a veritable scientific law. In The Descent of Man, he described the death of the natives of the British colonies as the inevitable consequence of the impact of civilization, which he took to be confirmation of his theory of natural selection. In short, he had no hesitation in applying the latter to a social phenomenon, thereby introducing a biologization of history and sanctioning the popularization of social Darwinism. Darwin meditated upon the struggle between civilized nations and barbarian peoples, comparing the extinction of the savage races to that of the fossil horse, which the Spanish horse replaced in South America. His argument continues as follows: the New Zealander seems conscious of this parallelism, for he compares his future fate with that of the native rat, now almost exterminated by the European rat. In a note in which he quotes the naturalist Poepping, he describes the breath of civilization as poisonous to savages. Degree. A few years after the publication of The Descent of Man, the Austrian social Darwinist Ludwig Gumplaues, for whom politics was simply an applied science, abandoned the metaphors of his master and explained more precisely how it was that civilization revealed itself to be poison to savages. He reminded the reader that the Boers considered the men of the jungle and the Hottentots to be creatures that it was permissible to exterminate as game. At the turn of the century, social Darwinism, eugenics, and theories of natural selection were to flourish particularly vigorously in America, where they were used to justify the genocide of the Indians and the rise of the United States as a major power on the international stage. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his famous lecture on the significance of the frontier in American history. In it, he used the frontier, the source of two essential principles of the American nation, democracy and individualism, as a metaphor for progress, the 61+ meeting point between savagery and civilization. It represented the limes or boundary of progress, and as it pushed forward it wiped out backward indigenous populations. The wild man must cease to exist, Turner declared. The eugenicist J.K. Hosmer interpreted the accession of the United States to the rank of a major power as confirmation of the civilizing mission of the Anglo-Saxon culture. English institutions, the English language, and English thought should become the principal features of the political, social, and intellectual life of the human race. His colleague Josiah Strong announced a new era, that of a final competition between the races, the natural consequence of which would be American hegemony. One of the most enthusiastic and convinced partisans of social Darwinism and white supremacy was the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who in The Winning of the West wrote that he considered the Anglo-Saxons to be a branch of the Nordic race and interpreted the conquest of the American West as a prolongation of the expansion of the Germanic tribes, celebrating it as the crowning achievement of this powerful history of racial development. Degree. In the wake of Francis Galton and his work Hereditary Genius, Madison Grant proceeded to move beyond social Darwinism and adopt a biological determinism in which natural selection was to be replaced by an artificial selection of races. According to Grant, the destruction of the Indians had pointed the way, by showing that an effective policy for the elimination of the weak, those unsuited to civilization, and degenerates would eventually make it possible to clear out the undesirables who fill our prisons, hospitals, and psychiatric asylums. But in 19th century Western imaginary representations, it was Africa that became the favorite screen for the projection of colonial fantasies. Africa was a continent conquered but still strange and mysterious, totally exotic, the exploration of which was felt to be and was represented as a descent into 62. The darkness of the earliest times. As such, it attracted the attention of writers, scholars, missionaries, adventurers. It provided an ideal mirror for the world that the West had invented, a continent that, unlike India which polarized the attention of a European culture obsessed by the Aryan myth, was quite naturally perceived as the refuge of primitive and savage humanity. The place attributed to the Africans in the racial typology established by Paul Broca, the founder of the Société Anthropologique de Paris, is by now well known. But it will perhaps be helpful to record the view expressed in the works of the British anthropologist William Winwood Reade, an explorer and great traveller now remembered for his lengthy correspondence with Darwin, for whom he provided extensive material for The Descent of Man. In 1863, Reade published Savage Africa, a long account of his travels brimming with geographical and ethnological data, descriptions of tropical forests and vast lakes, and also careful observations on local Maoris, rounded off by a chapter devoted to the redemption of this continent. After declaring that, faced with populations lacking both written language and any kind of culture, slavery was a necessity, Reade predicted the future that awaited the continent, following a long period of French and British colonization. Under the rule of these colonial powers, the Africans would transform their continent into a kind of garden, building towns in the depths of the forests and irrigating the deserts. After completing their task of inoculating this elixir vitae into the veins of their mother and restoring her immortal beauty, the Africans would be able to depart from the historical stage. Reed's conclusion ran as follows: in this amiable task they may possibly become exterminated. We must learn to look on this result with composure. It illustrates the beneficent law of nature, that the weak must be devoured by the strong. Asterisk. Reed described this extermination in typically British understated and sober terms, which in his final pages even took on bucolic, 63+ and nostalgic overtones. His book ends with a touching portrait that is worth recording: young girls seated on the banks of the Niger, described as a river as romantic as the Rhine, tearfully read a story entitled The Last of the Negroes. This huge debate on the extinction of inferior races, which were described sometimes as declining, sometimes as dying, and were inevitably condemned to make way for Western civilization, continued throughout the second half of the 19th century. Analyzed retrospectively, it emerges as an extraordinarily rich arsenal of racial stereotypes formulated in the language of science, morality, and the philosophy of history that was part of the culture of imperialist and colonialist Europe. Far more than that, though, it illustrates the attempts to rationalize and provide ideological legitimation for a vast project of conquest and genocide. Far from being the terrain of scholarly debates, concepts such as these deeply pervaded the political language of the period. In 1898, the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, divided the world into two categories, living nations and dying nations, and 2 years later Kaiser Wilhelm II delivered a passionate speech in which he urged the German soldiers sent to China to repress the Boxer revolt to exterminate the Boxers with all the violence shown by the Huns led by Attila. Such discourse, unimaginable in relation to a European nation, reflected the practices commonly pursued by all the colonial powers. Colonial wars and crimes. Of course, colonial wars, small wars, in the military jargon of the day, involved human and material resources on an incomparably smaller scale than those of World War IT. They did not fundamentally undermine the social structures and relations of the European countries involved and the total number of their victims, at least those resulting directly from armed 64 conflicts, was far lower than the millions who died in the 1914 to 1918 carnage. Nevertheless, the very concept of those earlier conflicts already rested upon the principle of total war. These were not the type of conflicts envisaged by international law, ones involving states hostile to each other but eventually resolved by peace treaties. Instead, they were undeclared wars of pillage and destruction that were brought to a conclusion only by the total submission of the conquered countries. The enemies were neither governments nor proper armies, but the populations themselves, which meant that no distinction was drawn between civilians and combatants. That is why France's General Bugeaud used to tell his officers that in waging war in Algeria, they needed first to forget most of what they had learned in their French military academies and realize that their battle was not against an enemy army, but against an enemy people. It was in Africa that the European states for the first time made massive use of the machine guns and other automatic weapons that had been tested in the American Civil War. This military superiority was decisive in the colonization of Africa and, as a result of a few crucial battles, allowed the British South Africa Company to keep Rhodesia, General Lugard to remain in Uganda, and the Germans to retain Tanganyika. Military history textbooks referred frequently to the Battle of Omdurman, in which, in 1898, a British unit numbering no more than a few hundred soldiers, under the command of Lord Kitchener and armed with modern machine guns, prevailed over thousands of Sudanese warriors, killing 11,000 of them. But over and above the superiority of the European armies, which only became overwhelming in the second half of the 19th century, when the far-reaching impact of the Industrial Revolution resulted in a qualitative transformation of military techniques, the secret of the colonial conquests lay in the 65+ rational organization of colonial military units, which were supported by an efficient administrative infrastructure, were kept constantly supplied, were regularly beefed up with fresh troops, and were able to maintain permanent links with the metropolis. In the long term, the catastrophic consequences of colonialism were to be revealed not on the battlefields, where all-in-all losses were limited, but throughout the conquered territories, as a result of a demographic decline that in a number of cases can only be described as genocide. The population of the present Sri Lanka before colonization was between 4 million and 10 million souls. By 1920, it had been reduced to about 1 million. Between 1830 and 1870, the Algerian population fell by 15 to 20% from about 3 million to 2.3 million. In the Congo, where the savage exploitation of King Leopold II's copper mines truly resembled a form of extermination through work, the population was reduced by half between 1880 and 1920, from 20 million to 0 million. On the Ivory Coast the population went, between 1900 and 1910 from 1.5 million to 160,000. In Sudan, there was a 75% drop. In 1882, the first year of British colonization, there were between 8 million and G million inhabitants. By 1903 the population had been reduced to between 2 million and 3 million. In Tahiti and New Caledonia there was a % decline registered. According to the most trustworthy calculations, the victims of the European conquests in Asia and Africa in the course of the second half of the 19th century numbered 50 million to 60 million, roughly half being due to the famine in India. The colonial wars waged by the Germans in southwest Africa at the beginning of the 20th century had the FIA 66 tours of a campaign of extermination that prefigured Hitler's 1941 campaign in the USSR. In 1904 the repression of a revolt by the Hereros in what is now Namibia assumed the aspect of a veritable genocide. General von Trotha, the chief officer in command of the operation, proudly claimed responsibility for issuing an annihilation order that became famous. The German authorities decided to take no prisoners among the combatants and to do nothing for the remaining women and children. These were simply moved away and abandoned in the desert. The Herero population, which in 1904 had numbered about 80,000 people, had been reduced to fewer than 20,000 1 year later. Similar methods were employed to put down the Hottentot revolt and resulted in having the population, from 20,000 to degree in the course of the following years, General von 10,000. Trotha was to declare in several articles that the extermination of the Hereros had been a racial war waged against peoples in decline or even dying. He explained that in this struggle, the Darwinian law of the survival of the fittest proved to be a more pertinent guide than international law. Registered in the debates that took place in the Reichstag at the time, the nationalists loudly voiced their approval of the annihilation of the savages and beasts revolting in Africa against colonial rule, while the socialists, though anxious to avoid mixed marriages in the colonies, stigmatized such episodes of violence, which reduced the German imperial army to a level of bestiality worthy of its victims. Those debates prove that notions such as racial warfare, extermination, and subhumanity were widespread in Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm as a result of colonial policies. Later, Nazism deliberately kept the memory of this past alive by means of its editorial strategies and the cinema. In 1941, just before unleashing war upon the USSR, German cinemas were showing 2 colonial films re. 67+. Leased for the general public, Karl Peters and Ohm Krieger. On the opening night in the Berlin Uferpalast, their importance was emphasized by the presence of Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. The last operation of colonial conquest, the Ethiopian War waged by the Italian fascists in 1935, bridged the gap between 19th-century European imperialism and the Nazi war for German Lebensraum. The Ethiopian War was justified by the classic arguments of colonialist racism and by demographic discourse of the social Darwinist variety and was waged with modern tools of destruction, in particular a massive use of chemical weapons. In June 1936, Mussolini ordered Rodolfo Graziani, the commander of military operations in Ethiopia, to pursue a systematic policy of terror and extermination against the rebels and all accomplice populations. Between 1935 and 1939, Ethiopian resistance was broken by warfare that combined conventional and chemical weapons and caused the death of 250,000 natives. The fascists' long-term aim was to direct Italian emigration toward the African colonies. Alessandro Lesina, the Minister for Colonies, dreamed of an Ethiopia without Ethiopians, populated by Italians and organized in conditions of apartheid, on the basis of a veritable segregation of the indigenous population. The anti-Semitic dimension of the racial laws promulgated by the regime in 1938 may have been the most visible and the most laden with consequences within Italian society, but those laws stemmed from the fascist insistence on separating Italians from the natives in African colonies. A number of historians have used the term genocide to describe this fascist colonial war. The photographs that show Italian soldiers brandishing the severed heads of Ethiopian resistance fighters may certainly be compared, in 68 terms of cruelty, to those, better known today, that testify to the activities of the Wehrmacht in Poland and the Soviet Union. Nazism and Lebensraum. The Nazi war against the USSR illustrates the historical links between the Hitlerian Weltanschauung and the European colonialism of the 19th century. The German Blitzkrieg of 1941 condensed all the aims of the Nazis, among which the desire to eliminate the USSR and communism was indissociable from the acquisition of Lebensraum, a living space for Germany in Eastern Europe. The Nazi General Plan Ost, developed cooperatively by several research centers using the services of numerous geographers, economists, demographers, and specialists in the racial sciences, envisaged the German colonization of the territories extending all the way from Leningrad to the Crimea. A few alterations were made to this plan after the beginning of the Blitzkrieg against the USSR and before the collapse of the Wehrmacht in 1943, but its major objectives remained clearly defined. The first stage involved evacuating through the deportment or elimination of about 30 million to 40 million racially undesirable Slavs. Over the next 30 or so years, about 10 million Germans and ethnic Germans were gradually to be installed, to colonize the conquered territories and rule over the Slavs, who would be reduced to slavery. The extermination of races judged to be harmful, such as the Jews and the Gypsies, was part of the overall plan and was to be completed during the conflict. In November 1941, during the German offensive against the USSR, Göring, in the course of conversations with the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Galeazzo Ciano, said that he foresaw that 20 million to 30 million Soviet citizens would be affected by famine in the course of the following year. The 69 plus. Wehrmacht's advance implied the systematic pillaging of all occupied territories. The Jews, who were considered to hold the power in the USSR and to be the brains behind the international communist movement, were an essential target of the Nazi war. The key to the extreme violence and brutality of this war certainly lies in the synthesis of conquest and extermination. At the legal level, expansionism in the East and the War of Conquest were justified by Carl Schmitt in an essay written in 1941 and devoted to the concept of Grossraum, to which we shall return later in this book. Schmitt recognized that the war then being waged called into question principles of international law, but he added that it was part of the expansionist tendency followed outside Europe by the great powers, upon which it was based. European law, the broad lines of which had been laid down from the 16th century onward, was designed to establish a European geopolitical order based upon an underlying postulate, colonial expansion outside Europe. Schmitt wrote, "The non-European space was without masters, uncivilized or only semi-civilized, a territory for colonization and the object of conquest by European powers which thereby became empires, thanks to their colonies overseas. So far, the colonies have been the spatial element upon which European law is founded. Portugal, Spain, Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands had all managed to build their empires. Prussia had not, so its territorial expansion could only be achieved at the expense of the neighbors, who belonged, legally, to the European community in substance," said Schmitt. German imperialism upset the European balance and attacked its laws, but its action was certainly in line with the Western tendency. In other words, the 770. Germans were simply applying in Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Russia exactly the same principles and methods as those already adopted by France and the United Kingdom in Africa and Asia. In conversations with Martin Bormann in 1941-42, Hitler frequently compared the German war on the Eastern Front to the colonial wars. The Slavic world had to be conquered and colonized so as to turn it into a sort of Germanic India, and its population had to be put down using methods of destruction comparable to those employed by the English in their empire and the Americans against the Indian tribes. The enslavement of the Slavic peoples and the extermination of the Gypsies and, above all, the Jews were regarded to be aspects of a process for which the European conquests in Africa and Asia and the Indian wars in America's far west provided the model. They were in line with a historical trend in which Nazi policies, which expressed a somewhat delayed imperialism, found their justification and natural place. Hitler, like other Nazi ideologues such as Alfred Rosenberg, made no secret of his admiration of Great Britain and even of Churchill, and praised the latter's pride, which stemmed from a sense of racial superiority and an awareness of the imperial mission of Great Britain. Thanks to the writings of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a Wagnerian racist of English origin, he had learned to draw a distinction between the old, aristocratic, colonial Great Britain of Burke and Gladstone and the modern, merchant, materialist kingdom, which was the very embodiment of civilization and was spiritually opposed to Germany. In the early stages of the war, Hitler continued to hope to reach an agreement with the British, on the basis of an equitable deal, German respect for British maritime hegemony in return for acceptance of German domination in continental Europe. 71 *. In August 1941, at the beginning of the offensive against the USSR, Hitler said, "What India was for England, the Eastern Territories will be for us." In September he again declared, "If the English were to be ejected, India would waste away. Our role in the East will be analogous to that of the English in India." It was a comparison that resurfaced constantly in his conversations during those crucial years, in which British imperialism was set up as a model. It must be possible to dominate that eastern region with 250,000 men led by good administrators. Let us follow the example of the English, who, with 250,000 men in all, of whom 50,000 are soldiers, rule over 400 million Indians. The eastern space must be ruled in perpetuity by the Germans. Around mid-October 1941, as the German armies reached the gates of Leningrad, Hitler was indulging in dreams of an Eastern Europe vanquished by Germany, dreams that inevitably call to mind the African fantasies of Winwood Reade. In 20 years' time Ukraine will already have 20 million inhabitants apart from its native peoples. In 300 years that country will be one of the finest gardens in the world. Completion of this civilizing mission inevitably entailed the extinction of natives, as a result of a process similar to the conquest of the American Far West. The natives will have to be shot. Our sole duty is to Germanize the country by the immigration of Germans, regarding the natives as redskins. In 1942 he compared the German repression of resistance in the occupied territories to the war waged on the Indians in North America. The natives were not to be Germanized but simply reduced to slavery. By extending his comparison of the Slavs of the Lebensraum to the Indians in the English colonies and the populations of Mexico before their conquest by Cortés, Hitler transformed them into non-Europeans. He excluded the idea of educating them, for that could only be to the detriment of the whites. Conflating the Slavs with the savages of Colorado 72. Nile imagery also cropped up in other conversations about the methods to be adopted for the colonization of the East. Hitler suggested teaching them a language of gestures, banning literature, and prohibiting instruction. The radio would suffice to provide the masses with amusement, as much music as they want. The colonization of the Slavic world obviously implied the elimination of the political, military, administrative, and intellectual elites of a number of occupied countries. The colonial nature of the war was impressed upon the German soldiers. In his work on the European Civil War, Ernst Nolte cites the testimony of Erich Koch, the redoubtable Reich Commissioner for the Ukraine, who declared that he had waged a colonial war as among Negroes. Asterisk. The German military hammered home the final aims that the Nazi world attributed to the war against the USSR. Omer Bartoi, one of the principal historians of the Wehrmacht, has analyzed the indoctrination of this army. Its central elements, after the annihilation of the Jews and the eradication of Bolshevism, were the struggle to win Lebensraum and the defense of the West. Shortly before Operation Barbarossa, General Hoepner had written that the war against Russia is an essential element in the German people's struggle for existence. It is the age-old struggle of the German tribes against the Slavs, the defense of European culture against the Muscovite Asiatic invasion, resistance to Jewish Bolshevism. The propaganda aimed at the Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front painted a terrifying picture of the political commissars of the Red Army, representing them in one pamphlet as the flayers of human beings. This Nazi pamphlet went on to declare that the figure cut by these commissars testifies to a revolt of Untermenschen against noble blood. In the last year of the war, the regime gave up trying to weld the army together around the prospect of victory, as it had in 1941, and attempted to do so by appealing to the defense of the West under threat. A. 73+. Directive to Nazi Wehrmacht officers summarized the goals of the war as follows: 1. Asia has never conquered Europe. We shall once again break the advance of this Asiatic tide. 2. The domination of Asiatic subhumans over the West is unnatural and contradicts the sense of history. 3. Behind the wave of the red masses, the rictus of the Jew is detectable. His thirst for domination will be broken, as his power in Germany has been. A last echo of this propaganda still lingers in contemporary historiography, for example in the works of Andreas Hillgruber, who has presented the struggle of the Wehrmacht in the last year of the war as a desperate and tragic attempt to defend the populations of Eastern Germany against the onslaught of Slavic barbarity, against vengeance, collective rape, arbitrary assassination, and the countless deportations perpetrated by the Red Army. At the time of the Historikerstreit, Jürgen Habermas was an unyielding critic of this apologetic orientation, which on the basis of a selective sympathy with the Eastern Germans led Hillgruber to continue to support the arguments of Nazi propaganda. Deportation, dehumanization, and racial extermination as undertaken by Hitler's Germany are in line with earlier ideas that were firmly anchored in the history of Western imperialism. The fact that National Socialism was the first to envisage a policy of extermination within Europe itself, targeting nations of the Old World, and in particular a people active at the origins of Western civilization, does not negate the connection. The logical and factual precedent for Nazi crimes was to be found in colonial wars, not in Bolshevik Russia. Asterisk. The connection, all too frequently obscured, nevertheless must be qualified. Nazi expansionism crossed a new threshold when it altered the hierarchy of the codes of classic imperialism. The imperialists occupied territories in order to pillage them, to seize their raw 74 materials, conquer new markets, and extend civilization, and to that end they needed to postulate the rationale of the European superiority over those colonized and if necessary to subject the latter to a policy of extermination. Nazism subscribed to the same logic, but the central and primary goal of its expansionism was to extend German domination on the basis of biological and racist claims. It was a matter not just of conquering territories, but of Germanizing them. For Nazism, eugenics and racism constituted far more than a justification and ideological cover for an expansionist policy, they were its very motor. Consequently, we must define the historical analogy more precisely. If it is reduced to a mechanical transposition of 19th-century imperialism to Nazi expansionism, there was a danger that a number of essential and specific aspects of the Hitlerian vision of the world will be lost. The Nazi regime envisaged a colonial solution to the Jewish question in 1940, at the moment of the defeat of France, a massive deportation of Jews to Madagascar that would coincide with the installation of Volksdeutsch groups in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. The plan was abandoned 1 year later, when the project of extermination became part of the offensive against the USSR. In contrast to the imperialist view of the colonized, Nazism did not regard the Jews as a backward, savage, primitive people or one that was incapable of surviving the onward march of progress. It considered them not as an archaic element that had lingered on the path of civilization but as civilization's enemy. In a famous speech, Communism Unmasked, delivered in September 1935, shortly before the passage of the Nuremberg Laws, Joseph Goebbels described the Jews as the guides of an internationale of subhumans hostile to culture. Degree in July 1941, at the beginning of the war against the USSR, the Minister of Propaganda produced an article reiterating his view of the German 75+ mission. For him, the soldiers of the Reich were the saviors of European civilization, which was under threat from a political underworld directed by the Jews. In 1942, the SS distributed 4 million copies of a pamphlet entitled Der Untermensch, in which the Jews were represented as the brains behind a state of subhumans. Their elimination was no longer of an instrumental nature, but took on the grandiose dimension of a struggle for regeneration that Goebbels liked to describe as an action of historic world importance. Degree The Nazi destruction of the Jews cannot be reduced simply to a measure of racial or social prophylaxis, let alone to a process of natural extinction, for it was conceived and organized as a crusade, a war of liberation. Trademark Eastern Europe certainly represented a living space, to be colonized, but that conquest implied the annihilation of the USSR and Bolshevism, a state and an ideology that the Nazis considered to be the product of an alliance between the Jewish intelligentsia and the Slavic subhumans. Registered The Red Army was the embodiment of this threatening alliance. Crushing it required measures quite different from those deployed in the 19th century colonial expeditions. What was needed now was nothing less than total war in the heart of Europe. The Jewish genocide was conceived and realized as part of that total war, a war of conquest that was both racial and colonial, and extremely radical. 3. Destruction. Total war. The Fordist Army. The first truly total war of the democratic age and the society of the masses was the Great War, in which 13 million men perished. It was the founding act of the 20th century. In August 1914, it was acclaimed in most European capitals as an opportunity to affirm the values of the nationalist ethos in the purificatory fire of warfare. But its violence was to submerge the whole world. The intoxication of patriotism gave way before the discovery of the modern horrors of anonymous mass slaughter, industrialized massacre, bombed towns, and ravaged countrysides. The fields of honor acquired a new face, trenches stretching for hundreds of miles in which soldiers crouched for months on end in the mud, surrounded by barbed wire and, often, corpses and rats. A far cry from the mythical image of the hero, soldiers now became a proletariat, workers in the service of a war machine. Stripped of the aura of the ancient warrior, soldiers were subjected to a military discipline in every way comparable to that of industrial production. The worker masses of a Ford-type factory were now matched by the soldier masses of modern armies. Hierarchy, obedience to orders, and the segmentation of tasks made it impossible for soldiers to understand, let alone control, the overall strategy within the context of which they operated. They waged war like workers on a production line, in a context in which fighting had lost all epic dimensions and been converted into a planned mass slaughter. The army as a whole was converted into a rationalized, mechanical business, with a hierarchy and a bureaucracy, and separate, coordinated sectors in which tasks were distributed on a strictly functional basis. As we have noted above, Marx had compared the industrial workers of the 19th century to soldiers. In World War I that model was reversed, now the army adopted the principles of a rationalized factory. The soldiers who manned machine guns were not elite marksmen but automata who, like factory workers on a production line, simply fed their weapons with ammunition. The military historian John Keegan has observed that the machine gun mechanized or industrialized the act of killing. Veterans have described the war as an endless industrial process. The Great War marked an essential point in the diffusion of Taylorism in Europe. Economy ministers adopted Taylorism in both Germany and France. The mobilization of young men at the front made it necessary to recruit a new workforce that was unskilled women and adolescents to work in the munitions factories, and so was perfectly adapted to the Taylorist model of scientific management. In the army, the ergonomists, hygienists, and psychologists of work found a productive field in which to try out their hypotheses on the disciplining of bodies, the organization of space, and psychotechniques. Specialists of the disorders linked with fatigue resulting from industrial labor neuroses, cataplexy, and so on made close studies of soldiers exhausted by life in the trenches or suffering from shell shock, who provided them with a vast field in which to test their theo. 79*. Rise. Medical vocabulary was enriched by new expressions such as shell shock and war hysteria that entered into common speech. Degree-registered engineers and psychotechnicians prepared for the reabsorption of mutilated men into industrial production. Just as chronometers now ruled the rationalized factories, in the army modern relations between bodies and machines and time and space called for strict coordination and calculations. On the morning of July 1, 1916, at 7:30 a.m., the start of the Battle of the Somme was signaled by whistle blasts from hundreds of unit commanders who had all synchronized their watches. In 1918, Max Weber highlighted the features that state administrations, factories, and armies all had in common in modern societies. The officer caste had been bureaucratized, it was now simply a particular category of officials, nothing like the knights and condottieri of the past or the Homeric leaders and heroes. In all the three domains Weber pointed to the same separation of the worker from the material means of operations, from the means of production in the economy, from the tools of warfare in the army, and from the material means of management in public administration. Just as, in business, leadership, programming, and production had become separate, hierarchized operations, in the army, strategy was now the task of a stratum of generals and officers always physically absent from the front line. In polar contrast to the warriors of earlier times, officers now hardly bore arms at all. Officers do not kill, for killing is not the business of a gentleman. That was one of the principles most solidly rooted in the system of military values in the period of total warfare. Technological warfare was the outcome of a tendency that had been gathering force ever since the 19th century's Industrial Revolution. Between the introduction of conical bullets in 1840 and of the modern machine gun in 1918, firearms had evolved considerably. Around the mid-19th century, *80. Bronze had begun to be replaced by steel in the fabrication of cannons that no longer used the old, solid cannonballs but instead used explosive shells, which were much quicker to load. By 1861, the American multi-barreled Gatling gun, soon copied in several European countries, ensured rapid, continuous, and prolonged fire. This weapon automatically completed in a single cycle all the operations previously executed separately, releasing the firing pin, opening the bolt, ejecting the cartridge, loading the new round, and locking it into place, making it possible to fire between 550 and 700 rounds a minute. By the end of the century it had become much smaller and easier to handle and move. But it was not until the outbreak of war, in 1914, that military leaders came to realize what changes this technical revolution implied on the battlefield. The extraordinary power of these new firearms had not yet been taken into consideration strategically. Staff headquarters were still assigning a crucial role to the cavalry and the infantry. In 1907, British military handbooks were confidently declaring that even the most modern rifles would never bear comparison with the speed and magnetism of a cavalry charge. In RGR-4, a soldier's equipment differed hardly at all from that of the first half of the 19th century. Officers' uniforms testified to preoccupations with aesthetics rather than function, and soldiers did not yet wear helmets. The firepower of machine guns had certainly been tested in Africa at the time of the colonial wars, but the racist prejudices of the military leaders had prevented them from drawing full conclusions from the experience. To them machine guns seemed useful when pointed at Hereros or Zulus but not suitable as replacements for traditional weaponry in a European war. The staff headquarters, solid bastions of the aristocratic strata and the very embodiment of the enduring Ancien regime, thus persisted in launching bayonet charges involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were recruited. 81 plus. Largely scythed down by the fire of automatic weapons. There was no chance of anybody's heeding one Matabele warrior's account of his first encounter with a British unit's machine guns, that they fired bullets as the sky emits flashes of lightning. Yet his testimony proved a fair enough description of the experience of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in Europe during World War I. The mass mutinies provoked by the massacres that occurred when bayonet charges were launched were repressed by martial law and a wave of executions, many of them by machine gun decimation methods similar to those used in the colonial wars against African tribes. The shocking discrepancy between the strategic ideas of the military elite and the reality of total warfare was eventually rectified at the technical level by the introduction of tanks, and was reflected within the military hierarchy by the replacement of those in command of operations. Lloyd George replaced Lord Asquith, Clemenceau replaced Viviani, Hindenburg and Ludendorff replaced Bethmann Hollweg, and Diaz replaced Cadorna. Asterisk. Mass anonymous death. The face of battle was changing. The rapid, violent military clashes of the 19th century were replaced by trench warfare. Offensives could last for months, mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers, were supported by an imposing logistic apparatus, and invariably became operations for the planned destruction of the enemy. Warfare became an industrialized form of extermination, far exceeding the technical and moral limits within which it had been described by Karl von Clausewitz a century earlier in On War. According to one German volunteer writing from the front, the most terrible aspect of this war was that everything had become mechanical. You could almost describe it as an industry specializing in human butchery. John Reed. 82. A newspaper correspondent who had already covered the Balkan Wars and the Mexican Revolution, was assigned to the Western Front, from which he reported in 1915 that he was watching a war between industrial workshops in which the trenches are factories that produce ruination, the ruination of spirits as much as of bodies, veritable death. During the last years of the war, Ernst Jünger wrote in Total Mobilization. Countries were transformed into gigantic factories for the mass production of armies in order that, 24 hours out of 24, it would be possible to send them to the front, where a bloody consumer process, likewise completely mechanized, played the role of the market. Asterisk. Refashioned by the material structures and cultural codes of industrial society, modern warfare was conceived as a gigantic business, the purpose of which, paradoxically, was the planned annihilation of the enemy, and the success of which could be measured by the extent of the massacre. Henry Barbusse had described the soldiers of 1914-18 as destruction workers, and similar formulations are to be found in the war recollections of Ernst Jünger and Arnold Zweig. In such conditions death became banal. It lost its epic character, death on the field of honor, and took on the typically modern aspect of anonymous mass slaughter. The hero in this war was not the soldier who, by virtue of his courage, qualities, and distinction, emerged from anonymity and entered the fellowship of Olympian heroism. Instead he was, the unknown soldier. As Roger Cale Lewis pointed out, now public veneration went to the poor wretch whose body had been the most disfigured and was the most completely broken, the one whose smashed countenance, no longer recognizably human, could not possibly resemble any face from the past, nor evoke any individual in any memory. That, indeed, was his sole virtue. The unknown soldier, whose anonymity was his sole claim to fame, was chosen at random from among a number of mutilated corpses. His 83 asterisk. Selection was a matter of pure chance. This, Cale Lewis insisted, was the end of heroic warfare. The enemy, dehumanized, became invisible. He was close by but hidden in his trench. This war is a war of invisibility, the art critic Camille Mauclair declared in 1918. Hand-to-hand fighting is a thing of the past, Jean Norton Crew stressed. having analyzed the testimony of veterans. With an enemy who remained invisible, warfare became a terrible slaughter carried out amid a total absence of hatred. Very often death was dealt, not by an enemy of flesh and blood, but by an impersonal, cold, alien, hostile machine. It was brought by mechanical monsters, by gas discharged by chemical weapons, or by flamethrowers. Amid this apocalyptic landscape, the soldiers in their helmets and gas masks had the air of artificial, mechanical figures stripped of all humanity, as some of Otto Dix's engravings show. In the memoirs of war veterans, the anonymity of the enemy is frequently described as a chilling phenomenon. Warfare against these ungraspable enemies introduced an anthropological break, revealing a new perception of human life that essentially paved the way for the genocides of the future. The Great War itself could certainly not be apprehended as genocide. But even as he recognizes this, John Keegan is forced to admit that there was something about the massacres of the Somme that calls to mind Treblinka. On July 1, 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties in the space of a few hours, 21,000 of them fatal. By October 18 of the same year, when the offensive was officially over, the death toll among the Anglo-French forces was calculated to be as high as 600,000, and the Germans had suffered comparable losses. The war turned armies into factories that produced death. The destruction of the enemy took place in accordance with the modalities of a system of production, as if conceived following the very same paradigm which, since 1913, had provided the basis for the manufacture of automobiles in 84. Henry Ford's American factories. The metaphor of the worker created by Ernst Jünger in 1932 in The Worker strikingly conveyed the fusion of the soldier and the factory worker realized by modern total warfare. And that warfare introduced a principle that was to lead to its paroxysmic culmination in the gas chambers of the Nazi camps. From this point of view, it is probably fair enough to represent Auschwitz as the most tragic of all illustrations of the excesses of Homo faber. Total warfare engendered a new concept of glory that was a very far cry from the myth of death on the field of honor, and that was to produce split human beings, inured to the schizophrenic coexistence of normality and murder. In some cases, the theaters, cafes, and restaurants of town centers were situated a mere few dozen miles behind the front line. Officers on leave, having breakfasted in their trenches, could that same evening be dining in a restaurant. Men who in civilian life were respectable, peaceful citizens, worthy fathers and husbands, as soldiers at the front had to become killers, and this metamorphosis was glorified as the vocation and mission of every true patriot. This plural, heterogeneous temporality that the war introduced into the European social space, the term non-contemporaneous, as used by Ernst Bloch, seems appropriate, was to have long-term consequences. It was in the trenches of the Great War that a new ethic and mentality were forged, without which the massacres of World War II would have been inconceivable. The First World Conflict did not produce crimes comparable to those perpetrated in Poland between 1941 and 1943 by Einsatzgruppen supported by the ordinary men of German police battalions *, but the anomalous and perverse coexistence of normality and destruction, of civilized behavior and murder, certainly paved the way for such crimes. 85+. Soldiers, civilians, and concentration camps. The total nature of the 1914-18 war, which lay at the origin of a transformation of modes of life and perceptions of time and the world for large swathes of society, did not stem solely from the vast scale of the human forces and materials that were mobilized. The dimension of total warfare also resulted from the fact that the boundary between the battlefield and civilian society was effaced. The theater of military operations extended over entire regions where the local populations became military targets, although on a far smaller scale than in World War II. The bombing of towns, the internment of nationals of enemy countries, and the deportation and forced labor of civilians marked a turning point in social relations and crossed a new threshold in the escalation of violence. Primitive practices assumed to have been banished forever, such as the taking of civilian hostages, reappeared and were compounded by the most modern inventions of chemical warfare. The principles of the state of law were suspended, and nationals of enemy countries were treated as prisoners of war. 60,000 Austro-Germans, Ottomans, and Bulgarians were interned in French territories, over 10,000 foreigners from Triple Entente powers Great Britain, France, and Russia were interned in Germany, 100,000 Belgian and French civilians were deported to Germany, and 100,000 Serbian civilians to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Unlike soldiers, interned and deported civilians were not protected by the law. As representatives of the Red Cross from neutral countries meeting at a congress in Geneva put it, they constituted a novelty of this war, international treaties had not foreseen them. Registered Hannah Arendt described this mass of pariahs as stateless people who were not guilty of transgressing the law but nevertheless objectively found themselves outlawed and therefore without its 86. protection. She detected in this phenomenon, which was to assume considerable proportions following the 1919 peace treaties, one of the essential conditions of modern genocides, the victims of which were human beings deprived of a legal existence and consequently deemed superfluous. As for prisoners of war, they became forced laborers. The Great War witnessed a massive diffusion of the concentrationary phenomenon, which had first evolved in South Africa for the internment of Boer civilians at the beginning of the century during the Boer War. Between 1914 and 1918, the expression concentration camps entered the vocabulary of Western countries. To be sure, from the point of view of the South African camp's purpose, the criteria for the selection of detainees, the living conditions to which these people were subjected, and the resulting mortality rate, there is no common measure between them and the KZ of Nazi Germany or the camps of Stalin's Gulag. Nevertheless, with their wooden huts and their electrified barbed wire fences, they presented a scene that would become all too familiar to millions of human beings over the next decades. During World War I, internment camps for displaced civilian populations and above all concentration camps for prisoners of war multiplied. By 1916 there were several hundred of them, scattered not only throughout Europe but also in India, Japan, Australia, Canada, and several African countries. Initially they had constituted a response to the need to provide somewhere to keep an ever-increasing number of prisoners within the framework of a war that was lasting much longer than had been foreseen, but soon they became fixed institutions, to which the military and political authorities tried to attribute a function at once disciplinarian and productive. With the introduction of the economic blockade against the Central Powers in 1915, the conditions of detention deteriorated so much for prisoners that the parcels of food and cloth 87** sent by their families and the assistance organizations of their native countries in many cases became essential for their survival. In the poorest countries where support from families that were mostly illiterate or semi-literate was limited, detention conditions were horrifying. Of the 600,000 Italian prisoners of war captured by the armies of the Central Powers between 1915 and 1918, close to 100,000 perished in the camps from cold, tuberculosis, and hunger. The testimony of a Red Cross nurse sent to work in the Ljubljana camp in 1917, following Caporetto's defeat, sounds strikingly like descriptions of the Muslims inmates suspended between life and death given by survivors from the Nazi camps. There were about 300 of them, all in rags, filthy, and famished. They were like living skeletons moved by the force of inertia, in an unconscious state, by now insensible to any manifestation of civilian life or any memories. In the Great War such experiences were exceptional and, above all, were not part of any planned strategy of dehumanization and annihilation. But they did constitute a field of experimentation for the concentration systems of the Nazis and of Stalin. The camps were a synthesis of prison and army, being at once places of disciplinary training and of labor. The prisoners were deployed in all kinds of productive activities such as tree felling and road or railway construction. Frequently the army hired them out as cheap labor, a procedure that the THIRD organization generalized and perfected in World War II. They were an unforeseen product of total warfare, made possible by the rationalization of armies and representing an important stage along the path that was to lead Europe from the prisons of the 19th century to the concentration camps of totalitarian regimes. 88. War memory. In the testimony provided by 1914-18 survivors, the image of death stands out as central to the experience of war. The trenches are described as cemeteries. The battle-scarred landscape is often evoked by an allegory, one of hell, which is strikingly similar to the descriptions of survivors of the Nazi concentration camps *. Other similarities, too, leap to the mind in the accounts of these survivors. First, the nauseous smell of death, the stench of the burned flesh in the extermination camps and of rotting corpses that assailed soldiers even before the front line came into sight. Then, the indescribable nature of the lived experience, the distance that separated it from the spoken or written word intended to reconstruct it. Primo Levi, along with many other deportees, was obsessed by that realization in the frequently recurring dreams of the Auschwitz nights, in which they tried to describe Auschwitz to their friends and families who, however, refused to listen. They had returned home and with passion and relief were describing their past sufferings, addressing themselves to a loved person, and were not believed, indeed were not even listened to. The reminiscences of survivors of the Great War are full of similar observations. For the German artist Franz Marc, the war was a gigantic battle that words will never be able to describe. For another painter, Paul Nash, the sight of the front was absolutely indescribable. For H. Cooper, the stench from the swollen corpses was beyond description. For Robert Graves, the periods of leave were indissociable from a deep unease. The idea of being and staying at home was terrible, for one was surrounded by people who could not understand that reality. The letters from Italian soldiers are studded with similar remarks, often written with spelling mistakes and clumsy turns of phrase but also with all the tang and authenticity of the language of the popular classes, impossible to render. 89+. In translation, the war is beyond imagination, everything is black and blood. I will not describe the battle as I am not allowed to, and anyway you could not understand it, so you must simply imagine that there, where it took place, it was total destruction. I felt I was at the cinema. One officer wrote. The war has etched upon everyone a mark of suffering that effaces individual features. The only eloquent expression of it is the silence that dominates them all. Paul Fussell believes that this gap between words and things was not caused by a failure of language, an absence of words to describe the reality. It was a matter not of language, but of rhetoric, the impossible task of making this war, understandable to anyone who had not lived it. In consequence, soldiers often cloaked themselves in silence, a silence that anticipated that of those who survived the extermination camps. In The Drowned and the Saved, Levi describes himself as a bad witness, precisely because he emerged alive from Auschwitz. The history of the loggers has been written almost exclusively by those who, like myself, never fathomed them to the bottom. Those who did so did not return, or their capacity for observation was paralyzed by suffering and incomprehension. Similar sentiments were expressed by those who witnessed death in the trenches and in no man's land. The American poet Lewis Simpson writes, "For an infantryman, war is a totally physical fact. That is why so many remain speechless when they think of the war. They feel that language falsifies physical life and betrays those who suffered its ultimate experience, death." In his 1936 essay on the figure of the narrator in the work of Nicholas Leskoff, Walter Benjamin represented the Great War as the crucial moment of a break in tradition in modern societies. As a consequence of that break, ancestral forms for the transmission of memories were abandoned, stories were suddenly relegated among the vestiges of a bygone age. It was now impossible for lived experience to be communicated in a form that could be perpetrated. 90. And enriched by being passed on by word of mouth. Benjamin wrote as follows: "The World War began an evolution that has been continuing ever since. At the time of the armistice, did we not notice that people returned speechless from the battlefield, not richer in communicable experience, but poorer. He then explained that the reason for this was that the war had radically undermined acquired experience, in particular bodily experience, through material battle. A generation that had still been going to school traveling in a horse-drawn tram found itself out in the open without protection in a landscape where nothing was recognizable, except the clouds, and, there in the middle of a force field invaded by destruction, tensions, and explosions, stood the tiny, fragile human body. Except in a few rare cases, painting was struck by that same silence, and artists were paralyzed both during and after the Great War when faced with the task of representing the death that was indissociable from total warfare. That experience brought about a break between contemporary history and painting. Lives unworthy of life. In order to apprehend warfare of annihilation, German soldiers had coined the term Verwüstungsschlag, a word that Stefan Anduin-Rauso and Annette Becker have aptly translated as blasting, destruction, devastation. Military strategists were also beginning to speak of warfare of annihilation, a neologism that was to occupy a central place in Nazi vocabulary. In retrospect, World War I can thus be seen as a laboratory of totalitarian violence, and, as Omar Bartov has pointed out, it was on its battlefields that the future architects of the final solution underwent their baptism of fire. The transformations of our mental world that war engendered included an inurement to violent death, and an indifference to human life that brought into question a number of past achievements banishing torture. Respect for the lives of prisoners and civilian populations that had been considered irreversible since the Enlightenment. Registered National Socialists found a sadly famous formula, filtered by the language of eugenics, to codify new devaluation of human life: Lebensunwertes life unworthy to be lived. George L. Moss cites a striking contrast to illustrate this turning point. In 1903, the town of Kishinev, in the Tsarist Empire, was the scene of a terrible pogrom in which about 300 Jews had been killed. This massacre aroused indignation and reprobation from worldwide public opinion, which was scandalized by such a barbaric episode. In contrast, the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians under the Ottoman Empire during World War I provoked no significant level of protest. Europe had become accustomed to massacre. The same indifference was to greet the genocide of the Jews during World War II. This change in European societies is clearly detectable in the drawings and paintings of Otto Dix and George Grosz, who shattered the silence of painters by demonstrating the horror of war by its effects on the world to which it had given birth. The urban landscape that they depict is chaotic and ravaged, with cripples and war-wounded on every corner. Many of the men are in uniform. When not depicted as wrecks littering a decadent decor, they animate the stage as hysterical figures, jerking frenetically as if convulsed by electric shocks. The impression conveyed by this twitching tangle of forms is that of a society that is sick, fissured, racked by incessant spasms, eaten away by some cancer. Gunther Anders remarked that Grosz's muse was nausea and the subject of his art was not the real world, but rather the destruction of the real world. The social universe represented by Grosz knows nothing of natural death. Violent death has become its normal condition. The extermination of men and the destruction of all that surrounds. 92. Them being killed as the most natural and ordinary modality of being, that is the world as depicted by Grosz. The devaluation of human life was accompanied by the dehumanization of the enemy, an idea that was diffused by military propaganda, the press, and scholarly literature too. The Great War provided an ideal field in which to apply the racial stereotypes developed by social Darwinism and the medical sciences since the last quarter of the 19th century. Nationalist propaganda abandoned all rational argument on the score of causes and justifications for the conflict, and instead appealed to a sense of belonging to a community under threat, calling for total, blind allegiance. The enemy always assumed the features of a hostile race, systematically described as barbarian. The Entente powers accused Germany, which had introduced chemical weapons, of displaying a brutality worthy of Huns. The word regularly appeared on their posters. In France, Dr. Edgar Berillon explained this cruelty by characteristics specific to the German race: Characteristics not only physical but also moral and psychological, all of which clearly likened the Germans to primitive peoples. As he saw it, the war atrocities revealed the Germans' criminal atavism. Their practices had no equivalent except among the semi-savage peoples of Central Africa and the Congo. As for Germany, it responded to such accusations with irony, recalling all its Nobel Prizes. It also officially urged that in the interest of humanity and civilization, colored troops should no longer be used in the theater of war in Europe. Its propaganda represented the world conflict as a fight to defend the people of an ancient culture against both the assault of Slavic and semi-barbaric hordes in the east and the threat in the west of the multiracial Franco-British armies, which were infiltrated by savagery owing to the presence of 93 colored soldiers and cannibals. The land of Kant and Beethoven saw itself under threat from cannibalistic tribesmen in uniform. A laboratory of fascism. The racist dehumanization of the enemy and the growing indifference with regard to human life also found expression in a brutalization of political life, which now adopted the language of warfare and methods of confrontation inherited from the trenches. In Germany and Italy, where political institutions and civilian societies underwent an overall dislocation when the conflict was over, warfare erupted into political life through the proliferation of armed units both on the left and above all on the extreme right. The ancient myths according to which the soldier was the embodiment of heroism and patriotism were now supplemented by the image of the new man forged by total warfare. Postcards and propaganda posters repeatedly depicted troops marching to battle, singing the national anthem, ready to fight with courage and a spirit of self-sacrifice. In traditional iconography, the fighter was represented as a proud human figure of classic beauty, in many cases ennobled by the medal displayed prominently on his chest that testified to his heroism. In contrast, the soldier of the new nationalist propaganda presented all the characteristics of Gingers worker. He was cold, mechanical, and menacing. His appearance was anything but human, his physique had a metallic, artificial quality. His hair was not visible, and his face, sculpted in clean, sharp lines, seemed to fuse with the steel of his helmet. A heavy charge of aggression and, you could say, nihilism emanated from his body, while his expression conveyed an unshakable tenacity. The fascist ethic, one of whose symbols was the steel helmet, AC-94, acknowledged its warlike origins. At the same time, within the codes of fascist aesthetics, this soldier who had turned his own body into a metal machine and his muscles into intermeshed steel gears that combined power with beauty could not fail to evoke the ancient warrior sealed into his armor. An ancestral aura surrounded the soldier of total modern warfare, the worker who was the embodiment of the technologized romanticism of the conservative revolution. The language of politics was transformed too. Italian fascism turned war into the supreme moment of life, exalting battle as a kind of fulfillment for man and for the triumph of strength, speed, and courage. In Germany, in the wake of Ernst Ginger, who had idealized warfare as an internal experience, Carl Schmitt interpreted it as both the condition and the triumph of politics in that it constituted a theater of confrontation between friend and foe. He produced neither a rational explanation nor an ethical condemnation of warfare. It simply stemmed from the recognition of an existential conflict with the enemy, the other, the alien, whose otherness represented the negation of one's own form of existence. The no man's land between the enemy trenches became the place that symbolized the new ethos of total warfare, a zone where law was suspended, where existence was affirmed by combat, a space of destruction and death, where life was exposed, naked, to the onslaught of a mechanical violence in the midst of a nature that had regressed to a wilderness thanks to the power of technology. No Man's Land was the concrete embodiment of Schmidt's exceptional state and Martin Heidegger's age of nihilism. Registered in society, the war marked a decisive stage in the process of the nationalization of the masses. Registered nationalism now became aggressive as it attempted to reproduce the logic of the front. The aesthetics of war flooded public spaces. Nationalism. 95 swung toward a crusading spirit of warfare. No longer was war exclusively the ideal of the ruling elites, but now it took hold of the masses, becoming a collective passion that was subversive and revolutionary. It opposed the tradition destroyed by the war and aspired to the establishment of a new order. New leaders of plebeian origin emerged from the masses, men marked by the experience of trench warfare and deeply involved in the post-war political crisis. World War I had set in train a new syncretism between mythology and technology, counter-establishment and political existentialism, nihilism and vitalism, romanticism and futurism, which was to find its most complete expression in National Socialism. In 1913, 1 year before the outbreak of war, the Italian writer Giovanni Papini, a strange figure who started out as an avant-garde critic but who eventually converted to nationalism, then fascism, and ultimately conservative Catholicism, published in the periodical L'Acerba an astonishingly prophetic essay entitled Life is Not Sacred. It contained a coldly lucid diagnosis of the new century, which Papini regarded as an age of industrial extermination in which life had irreparably lost its sacred aura. He wrote, "The whole of life in our time is devoted to organizing necessary massacres, some visible, others invisible. Whoever dares to revolt in the name of life is crushed in the name of that very life. Industrial civilization, like the civilization of war, feeds on carrion, cannon fodder, and machine fodder. Blood in the fields and blood in the streets, blood in the tent and blood in the factory. Life can only rise higher by, so to speak, discharging its ballast, a part of itself, as it moves unregistered." This passage indicates that the horrors of modern warfare had already been foreseen, and in some cases even celebrated in advance, for example, among the Italian futurists, by Avant 96. Guard literary figures. The warfare of the Great War was to operate as a powerful catalyst without which the fascist synthesis could not have happened, or at any rate could not have taken the forms that it did. Warfare's intrusion into politics, the nationalization of the masses, the brutalization of the language and methods of conflict, the birth of a new generation of political militants shaped by their experiences at the front, the formation of violently nationalistic and racist movements led by an elite of angry plebeians convinced that arms were called for if democracy was to be replaced, all these were features of the face of the Europe that emerged from 4 years of war. The new nationalist leaders no longer despised the masses in accordance with a conservative tradition that had been followed by figures ranging from Joseph de Maistre to Friedrich Nietzsche. Like Hitler, they had discovered their vocation as charismatic leaders in the streets, in demonstrations by war veterans and other post-war conflicts, or else, like Mussolini, in the context of war they had undergone a metamorphosis that had projected them from socialism into nationalism. This counter-revolution was not purely reactionary, as those of 1789 and 1848 had been, but became a revolutionary reaction or a revolution against the revolution. It was reactionary in its response to the workers' movement, the Russian Revolution, and Bolshevism, but revolutionary in that it aspired not to restore the past, but to create a new order that was nationalist, anti-democratic, and authoritarian. Such a convergence between populist nationalism and anti-Marxist and reactionary National Socialism had already been detectable at the end of the 19th century, in particular in France during the Dreyfus Affair, but was fully realized only after 1918. World War I was thus a decisive stage in the creation of fascism. In the fascist view, well illustrated by writers such as Filippo T. Marinetti, Wyndham Lewis, and Ernst Jünger, warfare lost its instrumental character and became an end in itself, an 97** existential experience that derived its source and justification from itself. For Marinetti, warfare was an aesthetic delight. He exalted its beauty, dynamism, movement, and artificial violence. Warfare realized the dream of a metallic human body for the first time, adorned the fields with flaming orchids flowering from machine guns, broke the silence of nature with the symphony of cannons, and created new geometric forms with the flights of bomber aircraft and the smoke spiraling upward from burning villages. For Jünger, war was a creative experience that he described as a warrior ecstasy and an eruption of sensuality. he depicted battle as an orgy of fury in which the refined pleasures of civilization and the intellectual sophistications of urban culture gave way to the sonorous clashing of a reborn barbarity. The energy that emanated from soldiers' bodies was that of a fairy tale festival, a pagan ritual that resuscitated a primordial, unadulterated violence with the power to re-establish a cosmic harmony that civilization had destroyed. As acrobats of death, masters of flames and explosives, splendid wild beasts, they hurtled across the trenches. At the moment of impact, they were the quintessence of all the warrior aggression that the world has ever produced, an exacerbated amalgam of bodies, will, and senses. For Jing-er, this frenzy created by the means of destruction of modern warfare was comparable only to the forces of nature that assimilated man to a howling storm, a furious sea, and rumbling thunder. The eroticism of the warrior community, technological nihilism, and anti-humanism were the essential ingredients of a new philosophy of death in which extermination became an end in itself. This new vision of death and destruction marked an anthropological turning point in the process of civilization, and prepared the way for the genocides of the 20th century. Walter Benjamin, who was a reader and sharp critic of Jing-er, discerned in this philosophy of warfare the expression 98 of an aestheticization of politics that found its fullest form in fascism. This exaltation of the unleashing of elements celebrated technology not as a key of happiness but as a fetish of decadence. It idealized battle, destruction, and death as an intensely lived primordial experience, a kind of electric shock and spasm that breaks the continuum of experience that is transmitted and crystallized in culture. Through its aesthetic transformation of the landscape, warfare produced the illusion of an artificial recreation of an original aura lost at the time of industrial capitalism. But this dark, runic magic resulted only in widening the gap between society and nature, in a rite of destruction and death. In One-Way Street, Benjamin wrote, masses of human beings, gases, and electric forces were hurled across the flattened countryside. High-frequency currents crossed the landscape, new stars rose in the sky, the air, and the depths of the sea hummed with the sound of propellers, and sacrificial ditches were hollowed out in Mother Earth. The description ended by commenting on the new face of humanity that modern warfare had revealed. During the last war's nights of extermination, a sensation comparable to an epileptic fit shook the entrails of humanity. In The Weapons of Tomorrow, an astonishingly prophetic article written in 1925, Benjamin alludes with cold irony to the chemical weapons that the German chemistry combine IG Farben was producing, weapons that contain the secrets of new techniques of murder. Let me try to sum up. The Great War was a major historical turning point that marked the advent of the 20th century, for it constituted at once a moment that condensed the preceding century's metamorphoses of violence and also the cataclysmic beginning of the Age of Extremes, with all its new practices of extermination. The Taylorist army integrated the 99 principles of authority, hierarchy, and discipline, and the instrumental rationality of modern industrial society, and provided a foretaste of the forms of domination founded on the mobilization of the masses that were to climax under the fascist regimes. The camps for prisoners of war were a crucial link in the transition from the panoptic model of the disciplinary prison to the world of the concentration camps of the totalitarian regimes. Once warfare was industrialized, the dehumanization of the enemy and his carefully planned destruction took a decisive leap forward, without which the Nazi practices of extermination would have been hard to imagine. Total warfare tended to efface all distinctions between the military and civilians, as is most clearly shown by the deportation and internment of the civilian populations of the occupied territories and nationals of enemy countries, and this revealed the link between warfare and genocides, which was to become a typical feature of the 20th century. The genocide of the Armenians was thus both a product of the lacerating contradictions inherent in the archaic Ottoman state and a result of total warfare. The war constituted a laboratory for new forms of propaganda from which the fascist regimes learned a great deal, propaganda designed not only to dehumanize but also, in many cases, to racialize the enemy. The focus that propaganda directed upon a number of racial stereotypes such as the innate barbarity of the Boks and, even more significantly, the cannibalism of the black troops serving in Anglo-French armies is equally revealing. On the one hand, it underlined the link between the mental world of colonialism and that of total warfare. On the other, it afforded a glimpse of the central place that racism was to occupy 20 years later, in the conception and practices of the Nazi war waged in order to conquer Lebensraum. The condensation of all these aspects in the experience of the Great War made it both a point of rupture in the history of Europe and an anteroom of National Socialism. 4. Classification and repression. Jewish Bolshevism (EUS), the carriers of Bolshevism and intellectual leaders of the German people, and a defense of European culture against the Asiatic and Muscovite flood. Hitler used exactly the same language in his private conversations. In 1941 he justified the war on the Eastern Front by the need to exterminate the hotbed of plague *102 bacilli, of which were the revolutionary Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, who were rootless and cosmopolitan and lurked unseen in the anonymous metropolises of the modern industrialized world, hostile to the very idea of nation and traditional order, was extremely common in conservative culture. The specter of Jewish Bolshevism haunted the nightmares of the ruling elites, liberal and nationalist alike, confronted by the revolutionary uprisings of 1917-21. In Russia, the White Terror set out to neutralize the Jewish microbe and launched against Jewish Bolshevism a propaganda campaign whose violence, the historian Peter Kenz tells us, prefigured the Nazi propaganda of World War II. The Jewish presence lurking behind Russian communism was strongly denounced in Rome, by the publication La Civiltà Cattolica, and also in France, by the right-wing press. In 1920, Charles Maurras, writing in Action Française, declared that the appalling vermin of Jews from the East that had infested a number of Parisian districts were bringing in fleas, pestilence, and typhus, while waiting for the revolution. Many manifestations of this myth are to be found in the literature and propaganda of the period, including those emanating from figures and institutions that, 2 decades later, were to become irreducible opponents of the Nazi regime. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was fabricated in the mid-1890s by order of Pyotr Rakowski, the chief of the Paris office of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police. Translated into many languages after World War I, it became an international bestseller. In Britain, which, unlike the countries of Central Europe, remained unaffected by the revolutionary wave, the historian Nesta Webster pondered upon the causes of the worldwide revolution, and explained them by the existence of a Jewish conspiracy designed to overturn civilization. In May 1920, the Times of London published an article, The Jewish 103+ Peril, in which it proposed an inquiry to investigate the veracity of the protocols. 1 month later it represented Trotsky as the leader of a Jewish internationale aiming to conquer the entire planet. Winston Churchill designated Marx, Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman as the incarnation of a world plot that aims to topple civilization. In a passage that is reminiscent of the protocols, Churchill detected in the Jewish presence the force hidden behind every subversive movement of the 19th century. He then went on to paint an alarming picture of the existing crisis. Today, this collection of extraordinary figures from the lowest levels of the great towns of Europe and America has grasped the Russian people by the collar and virtually made itself the uncontested master of a huge empire. Registered as he saw it, the Bolshevists were enemies of the human race, vampires sucking the blood of their victims, and atrocious baboons in the midst of ruined towns and heaps of corpses. At their head was Lenin, a rampant monster atop a pyramid of skulls, surrounded by a vile group of cosmopolitan fanatics. It was an image closely evocative of an anti-Semitic poster that represented Trotsky as a Jewish ogre enthroned upon a mountain of skulls. In Germany, the Nazi vision of the Soviet Union as the monstrous result of an alliance between the Jewish intelligentsia and the Slavic Untermenschen had been prefigured by Thomas Mann in his 1918 diary entries. Mann was the writer who, 20 years later, would represent the tradition of the Aufklärung in exile. It is true that his language was literary, not biological, and his argument stemmed more from the romantic view of the intellectual conflict between culture and civilization than from the stereotypes of fin de siècle racial anthropology. But the fact remains that he did interpret the Russian Revolution as the result of the convergence of the Jewish 104. Intelligentsia and Slavic nihilism. He saw it as an explosive mixture of Jewish intellectual radicalism and Slavic Christian mysticism and warned against the diffusion of such an epidemic. A world that preserves even an atom of the instinct of self-preservation must take action against these people with all the mobilizable energy and promptitude of martial law. In 1919, that energy was to be deployed by the army of Gustav Nitzsche and the Free Corps. In Germany, Hungary, and Poland, anti-communist posters provided a strongly expressive illustration of counter-revolutionary imaginary representations. In these, Bolshevism assumed the features of horrible imaginary Semitic monsters, specters of death that symbolized imminent catastrophe, a horde of savage beasts that were the very incarnation of brutal, barbaric violence. In the Baltic states, which were plunged into civil warfare between 1918 and 1920, the struggle against Jewish Bolshevism was one of the main pillars of counter-revolutionary agitation, and the Freikorps recruiting among the German minorities there played a leading part. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania constituted a laboratory for the amalgamation of race and class that, 20 years later, was to be central to the Nazi war against the USSR. A number of future Nazi leaders proved themselves there, among them Alfred Rosenberg, the theorist of biological racism who later became the Third Reich's minister for the Eastern Territories. He was born in Tallinn, Estonia, but settled in Munich at the end of 1918, after witnessing the civil war in his home country. By the early 1920s, the vision of the Jew as the motivating force of the revolution and the master of the Russian Empire was one of the bases upon which the Nazi ideology rested. Ernst Nolte simplifies greatly when he reduces National Socialism simply to a product of the Russian Revolution, but undeniably the revolution was a major dimension of it. The Jewish presence within Bolshevism and within other revolutionary movements in Central Europe may well have been particularly striking, but all the same it was not October 1917 that engendered Nazi anti-Semitism. Anti-Bolshevism was grafted upon a German nationalism whose principal basis had always been anti-Semitism and pan-Germanism. The amalgamation of those three elements, anti-communism, imperialist expansionism, and anti-Semitic racism, was the distinguishing feature of Nazism and bestowed upon it a radicalism previously unknown. The novelty of Nazism, apart from the fact that its energetic measures far exceeded anything Thomas Mann or Churchill could have desired or conceived at the end of World War I, lay in its extreme biologization of anti-Semitism, which reformulated the myth of a plot and the old cliché of the Jew as an anti-nationalist element in terms of racial hygiene. Hitler, who inherited this portion of his views from Völkisch nationalism, regarded the Jews as a virus that had to be eradicated, of which Bolshevism was simply an external political manifestation. From 1920 onward, his speeches were full of references to Marxism as a Jewish creation, to communism as a racial tuberculosis, to the Jews as carriers of Bolshevism, and to communist parties as the mercenary troops of the Jews. Eberhard Jäckel has drawn up an impressive list of the characterizations of the Jews to be found in Mein Kampf. Almost all are borrowed from the vocabulary of parasitology. The Jew is a worm in a rotting body, a pestilence worse than the Black Death of the past, a carrier of bacilli of the worst kind, the eternal schismicide of humanity, the spider that slowly sucks out a people's lifeblood through its pores, a band of rats that fight each other to the death, the parasite within the bodies of other peoples, the very epitome of a parasite, a scrounger that proliferates more and more, like a harmful bacillus, the eternal leech, the vampire of all peoples. Copyright Alfred Rosenberg, who had denounced Bolshevism in the early 1920s in a pamphlet titled Plague in Russia, was to declare 20 years later in the myth of the 20th century, that the accession of Lenin and Trotsky to power in 1917 had only been possible within the body of a people diseased both racially and psychologically. In Mein Kampf, Hitler famously alluded to the tragedies that Germany could have avoided if only the Jews had been wiped out by gas in the course of the war. Registered, the Nazis' predilection for pathological images is certainly well illustrated by their extensive use of the notion of Jewish Bolshevism as a manifestation of the sickness of the social body. Hitler's favorite medical metaphor besides syphilis and tuberculosis was cancer, against which the Third Reich had adopted the most radical and far-reaching hygienic policy in Europe. Meanwhile, this contamination of political propaganda by medical and epidemiological language was matched by a massive adoption of political metaphors on the part of scientists. Bernhard Fischer-Waisels, one of the founders of research into tumors, described the embryonic stage of cancer as a new race of cells quite distinct from others, and he proposed therapy aimed at the destruction of this pathological race. 130. Upon the basis of this modern, mechanical, and soulless society, which truly was the antithesis of the pre-industrial organic and natural community, they were seen as representing the abstract, economic rationality of finance and democratic universalism, tailored to fit an equally abstract kind of humanity that was defined by the law instead of by tradition, a sense of belonging, and deep local roots. In this conflict that irreducibly set community in opposition to society, the Jews were perceived as a chemically pure concentrate of the latter. The real Jews were replaced by the universal and undifferentiated category of the Jew. The mutation that had liberated Jews from their former status of pariahs and had normalized them within society, where they became citizens like everyone else and, at least subjectively, equal members of a national community, was accompanied by a new form of negative otherness. The age-old stranger living on the margins of society was still a stranger because he now embodied a modernity that itself had become strange and hostile to a nation still strongly attached to its traditional values. As the personification of the abstraction that dominated the social relations of the capitalist, urban, and industrial world, the Jew was stripped of his real features and became simply a metaphor for modernity. The above view was not expressed only as political anti-Semitism. It also found expression in a vast philosophical, economic, and historical literature in most Western countries. In his philosophy of money, George Simmel, himself for many years a victim of anti-Semitic discrimination in the German academic world, drew attention to a whole series of affinities between Jews and monetary circulation, modern intellectualism, and liberalism. After emphasizing the Jew's ability to move more freely within the combinations of formal logic than in creative production concerned with its own content, he suggested that, as totally uprooted human beings, they were the representatives of a society dominated by the abstract rationality of money, because it comes between things and man, allows the latter a quasi-abstract existence, free from any direct regard for things. In France at the turn of the century, the vision of the Jew as a pure abstraction was widespread just as much among Dreyfusards as among nationalists and the anti-Semitic. In the eyes of Maurice Barrès, the Jew was an incomparable logician, whose reasoning as incisive and impersonal as a bank account. The Catholic Dreyfusard intellectual Anatole Leroy-Beaulieu regarded the Jew as a pensive figure, an individual characterized by the predominance of the nervous system over the muscular system, frequently neurotic or even hysterical and far more inclined to physical deformity than an Englishman or a native of the Auvergne. It would be ridiculous to expect a Jew to have the fine body of a Greek or the fine presence of an Englishman. This tendency to physical degeneration was, however, balanced by an impressive, calculating rationality. The Jewish mind is a precision instrument. It possesses all the accuracy of a weighing machine. Degree registered for André Gide, Jewish intelligence was marvelously organizing, clear-cut, and classificatory, capable of picking up the trail of an idea and reconnecting the thread of an argument just as one arranges objects in a drawer. But rational rigor had a downside. The Jew possessed the most anti-poetic of minds. When reformulated in anti-Semitic literature, this view gave rise to the antithetical pair Jew/Aryan. Edouard Drumont, in his work La France Juive, was one of the first to contrast the commercial, cerebral, and calculating Israelite with the agricultural, heroic, and creative Aryan. This work was already amalgamating and interweaving nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism. It drew on a remarkable mixture of themes plus 132. Borrowed from French socialist anti-Semitism, Catholic and reactionary anti-Judaism, and the new scientific racism. La France Juve did not yet go so far as to propose a coherent and well-defined therapy, but it did present a number of affinities with German Völkisch anti-Semitism. Registered during the interwar period, several writers placed the Jew/Aryan antithesis at the center of their works. Céline, in his Bagatelles pour un massacre, depicted the Jewish intellectual as a literate robot, totally bereft of any creative spirit and fundamentally a corrupter of art. Nothing was more alien to the Jew than authentic, spontaneous emotion, geared to the natural elements, for his deep-seated vocation impelled him to seek out whatever was standard in all things, hence the dominant role that he played in society, for a modern civilization means total standardization, body and soul, under the Jew. Pierre Drouot La Rochelle devoted one of his best-known novels, Jill, to this theme. In it he produced an ironic formulation to convey the abstract and profoundly inauthentic Jewish existence: a Jew is as horrible as a polytechnician or a product of the École Normale. In Germany, the Jew/Aryan dichotomy corresponded to the conflict between civilization and Kultur and left its mark on the writings of all the theorists of the conservative revolution. In his most famous book, The Decline of the West, Oswald Spengler opposed the wisdom typical of pre-modern societies, permeated by religious spirituality and the foundation of Kultur, to the abstract intelligence of the industrial and urban world, which smacked of atheism and was the basis of modern, rational, but rootless civilization. Wisdom presupposed an organic, natural community, in which order stemmed from religion and myths. The intelligence that was flourishing in the anonymous and cosmopolitan metropolises had replaced religion and myth with psi. 133 *. Antific theories. The opposition between those two worlds explained why the Jews were totally alien to Kultur. The Jew has never understood the internality of the Gothic, the castle, and the cathedral, and the Christian has understood neither the superior, almost cynical intelligence nor the financial thinking formed by its own establishment there and its own labor of cultivation. Soil that is the source of its concrete forms of power is incomprehensible to the Jewish mind. Degree. In short, the gross Raum of Schmidt's vision was of an eminently existentialist nature. It implied space seen as a conquest linked with a vital need. The mastery of a space is the mark of all existence, he wrote. Again quoting Ratzel *, the mission of National Socialism was to set up a German empire founded upon this combination of concrete order and localization. Jews ter Ende, German, versus Jews scriptum, Jewish, Schmidt's earthy nomos related to a people rooted in its soil. Others were reformulating the new anti-Semitism in scientific terms. In the universities, Nazi scholars elaborated a German physics, whose main target was Einstein's theory of relativity, branded as Jewish science. For Philip Leonard, the main characteristic of such a theory was its abolition of the ether, so that physics was explained by means of abstract equations, instead of intuitively self-evident images of nature. Degree. Johannes Stark stressed the great difference between Jewish science, which was dogmatic and deductive, and a pragmatic and inductive Nordic science, which was linked with experience. Nazi anti-communism followed the same logic of rejecting abstraction and biologizing otherness. The Jews constituted the brains of the communist movement, and internationalism was a new form of abstract universalism and cosmopolitanism, which were destructive of the Aryan Volksgemeinschaft. Revolutionary, countryless Jewish figures such as Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Radek, Gregory Zinoviev, and Leon Trotsky embodied the rootless and groundless universalism of Marxist culture. For Hitler, Jews and Marxism were synonymous terms. One of the first public actions of the new regime, in 1933, was the burning of Jewish, Marxist, and anti-fascist books in the principal towns of Germany. The most important auto da fe, in Berlin, was presided over by Joseph Goebbels, who solemnly announced the end of the era of Jewish intellectualism before a crowd of students gathered outside Humboldt University. In short, one of the fundamental characteristics of Nazism was its destruction of abstract legal forms by a concrete scheme of thought, oriented by the notions of soil, race, living space, will, and so on. The old dichotomy between civilization and Kultur could now be reformulated. Nazism thus took over the image of the Jew as a pure abstraction and a metaphor for civilization. In this respect, it was the offspring of 19th-century anti-Semitism. Mein Kampf is stuffed with formulae borrowed from anti-Semitic literature that attribute a Jewish character to all manifestations of political modernity. However, the specific features of Nazism which accentuated and went beyond both traditional racist nationalism and the conservative revolution stemmed from its extreme biologization of anti-Semitism. The crusading spirit of the old religious anti-Judaism was combined with the coldness of scientific anti-Semitism, hence the horrifying World War II mixture of pogroms and industrial extermination, eruptions of brute violence and administrative massacre. The revolt against the decadence of the modern world appropriated the means of that very modernity, industry, science, technology, so as to efface any figure who might be supposed to be responsible. The negative goals of Nazism, anti-liberalism, anti-Bolshevism, and counter-Enlightenment feeling converged with its constructive undertakings: the racial state, the conquest of vital space to produce a unified anti-Jewish crusade. The battle was waged using the juridical *144. Instruments of the state, the destructive force of an army, and the modern means of industry, but its necessity was explained using arguments borrowed from science. In 1942, Hitler declared, "Tracking down the Jewish virus is one of the greatest revolutions ever achieved in the world. The battle that we are waging is of the same nature as that waged in the last century by Pasteur and Koch." How many diseases originate in the Jewish virus? Mysticism founded on nature, anti-humanist irrationality, and the redemptive myth of a return to the land led to a policy of genocide represented as a disinfection, a purification, in short, an ecological measure. The Jews, who embodied an abstract form of humanity, were to be wiped out in the name of the preservation of nature. Their elimination was necessary for the accomplishment of a natural law that presupposed a homogeneous human race. In 1941, the ideologue Theodor Seibert explained in an article in the Völkischer Beobachter that the struggle against the USSR and Jewish Bolshevism had nothing to do with the war being waged in the West against France and Great Britain, for it was a fight against an enemy of life. His thesis contained all the elements of a regenerative anti-Semitism. In 1939, Hans Kohn had written, "The racial theory, as evolved by the National Socialists, amounts to a new naturalistic religion for which the German people are the corpus mysticum and the army the priesthood. The new faith of biological determinism, fundamentally opposed to all transcendent and humanist religion, bestows upon the people an immense strength in their permanent total war against every other conception of man, be it Christian or rational. The people now represent the Reich, the realm of salvation, the enemy represents the anti-Reich, it 145** becomes as much of a mystical and mythical fiction as the Reich itself, only that the one is invested with all imaginable virtues, and the other with all imaginable, and sometimes unimaginable, vices. One of the weaknesses of this position lies in the fact that, whereas the Reich has a constant factor, the anti-Reich is a variable factor, according to circumstances, the political exigencies of one moment generating another adversary than those of another moment. Here Chancellor Hitler made a master move by pointing out the Jews as the anti-Reich, and by identifying all his enemies with Judaism. Thus he could unmask the accidental enemy of the hour, Russia and communism, Great Britain and democracy, France and the United States, President Roosevelt and capitalism, in short, whoever seemed to stand in a concrete situation in the way of the fulfillment of German wishes, as an instrument of the devil, opposing the march towards the salvation of the Reich. This racial concept of politics, to be brought to bear directly on the species, not on a world inhabited by people defined as political beings, could very well be described as biopolitical, for its aim was the management of bodies, of natural life. In the terms of political science, such a concept of nature is totalitarian, for it presupposes the suppression of politics as a field of conflict and pluralism, as a public sphere superior to and emancipated from the biological sphere. Hitler considered himself the prophet of this National Socialist religion of nature, and it was certainly in prophetic terms that, in January 1939, he announced the annihilation of the Jews of Europe in the event of a new world war. To the extent that anti-Semitic violence took on the aspect of a liberating crusade that aimed to fulfill the eschatological expectations of National Socialism, the latter could well be defined as a political religion according to Raymond Aron, a doctrine that takes possession of people by 146. Filling the place of a vanished faith and by situating the salvation of humanity here below in the distant future, in the form of a social order yet to be created. Nazism was a political religion whose premise was a radical rejection of the Enlightenment and all humanist philosophies of secularization. However, the regenerative anti-Semitism of Nazism cannot be reduced to the fulfillment of Christian Judeophobia, in a predetermined drama in which Nazism undertakes the final assault against the Antichrist. A number of elements from the Christian religion were incorporated into the Nazi Weltanschauung, which thus possessed a syncretic character in which eschatological attitudes inherited from Christianity were intermingled with other components that were eminently modern and profane, at once scientific and also political. The amalgamation of these elements produced something radically new, something unprecedented in relation to all previous forms of an ideological codification of racial and anti-Semitic hatred. If the Jew embodied the abstraction of the modern world, the biologization of anti-Semitism was the key to a modern revolt against modernity. If the Jews were seen as a personification of the abstract social relations of capitalism, the struggle against the Jahre could be won by the elimination of these Jews. If civilization meant money, finance, calculation, exchange, the stock exchange, anonymous towns, egalitarian and rootless universalism, a collection of values of which the figure of the Jew appeared to constitute the synthesis and biologically pure crystallization, then it could be vanquished by eliminating the Jews with the aid of the concrete forms of civilization itself. The incarnation of capitalism was to be destroyed by industrial methods ** the Jew, a. 147 *. Fetishized social figure and a biological metaphor for the modern world, was the catalyst for regenerative reaction. Through the destruction of the Jew, technology could be regenerated and placed at the service of nature. The religion of nature, or, if you prefer, National Socialist biopolitics, was thus represented as a form of reactionary modernism capable of realizing a synthesis between counter-Enlightenment feeling and scientism, between obscurantism and technology, between an archaic mythology and a totalitarian order, between medieval persecutions and racial biology, and between pogroms against the Jews and their cold, impersonal, and mechanical elimination, as in an abattoir. Regenerative anti-Semitism, which finally, within the framework of World War II, led to a vast operation of genocide, is the clue to the historical uniqueness of National Socialism. It was a product of German history, and it was the pillar the Nazi vision of the world rested on. Many historical factors contributed to the radicalization of German anti-Semitism and transformed it into the ideology of the political movement that managed to appropriate power. The persistence, up until 1918 at least, of political structures of the Ancien regime, the tensions created by the process of industrialization and intense, rapid, and destructive social modernization in the last quarter of the 19th century, the social and political crisis engendered by the defeat and collapse of Kaiser Wilhelm's Reich, the intrinsic fragility of the republican institutions that replaced the latter, and the geopolitical position of Germany, which as early as 1918 placed it at the center of the clash between revolution and counter-revolution on a continental scale. But it would be a mistake to deduce from all this that those historical circumstances had isolated Germany from the West and had set it on a separate special path. On the contrary, these circumstances *148 made it the laboratory of the West, one that synthesized a collection of elements: nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, imperialism, anti-Bolshevism, anti-humanism, and counter-Enlightenment feeling, all of which existed throughout Europe but which elsewhere either remained muted or else never entered into toxic combination. His genealogical study sets the Nazi violence within the long-term context of European history, but does not suggest that it stemmed from the latter automatically, ineluctably, in accordance with a pitiless and fatal causality. Even if Auschwitz was a product of Western civilization, it would be overly simplistic to see it as the natural outcome of that civilization. Rather, it might be interpreted as a pathological manifestation of it. What we need to do is seize upon the concatenation of elements that made the Nazi extermination possible. The crime took place and it now illuminates the mental landscape in which it happened, providing us with precious evidence to use like investigating detectives to identify the victims, the murderer and his accomplices, the motivations for the crime and the means used to perpetrate it. In this work, the paradigm of a detective investigation has been applied to the analysis of the blindingly visible clues left by Nazism. The work of identifying the victims, the assassin, and the murderer's accomplices was laborious but has long been completed. But what is more controversial is the definition of the motives and the weapons used in the crime. Nazism certainly reinterpreted those motives and weapons in a new way, but they were all part of the context of Western civilization, in the widest sense of the expression. Some of the clues to be found in the Hitlerian discourse, such as racial biology, have been the subject of an in-depth historiographical analysis. Others that have more to do with mental attitudes * have not as yet received enough attention. The idea that civilization implies the conquest and extermination of inferior or harmful races, and the instrumental concept of technology as a means for the organized elimination of the enemy were not invented by the Nazis but had been notions familiar in Europe ever since the 19th century and the advent of industrial society. The genealogy traced in the present study emphasizes the fact that the violence and crimes of Nazism emerged from certain common bases of Western culture. It does not show that Auschwitz revealed the fundamental essence of the West, however, it does suggest that it was one of its possible products and, in that sense, was one of its legitimate offspring. The uniqueness of Nazism thus lies not in its opposition to the West, but in its capacity to find a way to synthesize the West's various forms of violence. World War II was when all the elements identified in this genealogical study came together. The war was conceived as a clash between different ideologies, civilizations, races, in short as a Weltanschauungskrieg. Obsessive eugenics, racist impulses, geopolitical aims, and ideological crusading converged in a single wave of destruction. The Jews Trägheit as the incarnation of civilization, the ruling group in the USSR, the inspirers of Marxism, the living antithesis of the idea of Lebensraum, the bacillus that was destroying the Aryan race, and the brains behind the international communist movement found themselves at the heart of a titanic war of conquest and annihilation and thus became the catalyst for Nazi violence. The guillotine, the abattoir, the Fordist factory, and rational administration, along with racism, eugenics, the massacres of the colonial wars and those of World War I had already fashioned the social universe and the mental landscape in which the final solution would be conceived and set in motion. All those elements combined to create the technological, ideological, and cultural premises for that final solution, by constructing an anthropological context in which Auschwitz became a possibility. These elements lay at the heart of Western civilization and had been deployed in the Europe of industrial capitalism, in the age of classic liberalism. Until 1941, Hitler probably had no definite plan for methodically exterminating the Jews. The final solution was the product of the ceaseless interaction between his radical anti-Semitism and the circumstances of the war. It was this interaction that engendered the stages, forms, and means of the deportation and slaughter of the Jews. But even though it lacked a central plan, National Socialism was provided with many models, which it did not hesitate to follow. Some were ideological, political, or historical, others were technological and social, but all had their origins in the context of the European civilization. From this point of view, the singularity of the genocide of the Jews seems to be less an event without precedent, an event without comparable historical example with regard either to its dimensions or to its total configuration, in Raoul Hilberg's words than a unique synthesis of a vast range of modes of domination and extermination already tried out separately in the course of modern Western history. It was the synthesis that was unique and therefore radically and terribly new, to the point of being unimaginable and incomprehensible to many of its contemporaries. As we look back, we can see that the fusion of historical plus 152 experiences and models of reference, some openly acknowledged, some subconscious or even unconscious, points to the historical genealogy of National Socialism. It would be fair to say that if ever there was a German Sonderweg, it may be detected not in the Prussian Empire and the process of national unification but under the Nazi regime from 1933 onward. It led not to the origins but to the ultimate destination of Nazism. Hilberg's somewhat trenchant declaration thus prompts an observation that can be formulated borrowing the words of the historian Mark Bloch, the co-founder of the Annales d'Histoire économique et sociale. He recognized European feudalism to be a social structure that certainly bore the imprint of a particular time and a particular place, but at the same time, by cutting across comparative history, was able to show that many of its features were shared by traditional Japan. He concluded that feudalism was not an event that happened in the world only once. In the wake of Bloch, it could similarly be said that even if the final solution certainly bore the imprint of a particular time and place, some of its features had already characterized the wars of conquest, other campaigns of extermination, and other waves of counter-revolutionary reaction. At the risk of being repetitive, let me stress that the present genealogy should not be understood teleologically. Roger Chartier has remarked of the French Revolution that although it certainly did have intellectual, cultural, and other origins, its own history is not encompassed by them. Registered, those words apply equally well to Nazism. Even if industrial extermination does presuppose a factory and a rational administration, that is not to say that it stems ineluctably from them, nor that any capitalist enterprise is bound to constitute a potential death camp, nor that there is a dormant Eichmann inside every official. The final solution exploited the results of scientific research, in particular chemical research, and made use of numerous doctors, anthropologists, and eugenicists, and this certainly reveals the destructive potential of science. However, it does not reduce medicine to a science of death. The colonial massacres introduced practices of extermination that were later to be applied and exceeded by Nazism, but that does not establish a relationship of cause and effect between the two. All the same, that observation is not particularly reassuring. There are no grounds for ruling out the possibility that in the future, other syntheses equally if not more destructive might again crystallize. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki show that anti-Enlightenment feeling is not a necessary premise for technological massacres. Both the atomic bomb and the Nazi camps were part of the civilizing process, and within it they constituted an expression of one of its potentialities, one of its faces, one of its possible offshoots, not a counter-tendency or an aberration, as Norbert Elias believes. Point 2. On the other hand, neither does the absence of causality here mean that everything can be reduced to fortuitous and purely formal affinities. The architects of the Nazi camps were well aware that they were building factories of death, and Hitler made no secret of the fact that the conquest of Lebensraum followed the precedent set by the colonial wars of the 19th century. The massacres of the imperialist conquests and the final solution are linked by more than phenomenological affinities, degree and distant analogies. Between them runs a historical continuity that makes liberal Europe the laboratory of the violences of the 20th century, and Auschwitz an authentic product of Western civilization.